In a military camp set within the Compton mountain range, reports arrive stating that scouting operations have been obstructed by relentless rain, though strange lights have been spotted to the northeast. And with visibility poor, the soldiers assume the lights belong to McCarthy's men. Leading the camp is Count Vonalista, and upon hearing the report he rises to confirm the situation himself. While the soldiers grumble about the hardship they are enduring, forced to operate in another man's land, simply because of the rarity of a dragon. All while knowing the Count seeks favor from towns and dukes, with rumors spreading that he is a waste, though they still take comfort in believing he can lead them in battle. Unknown to them that belief is misplaced, because the man beneath the helmet is not Adrian at all, but Hans, who has served Callista since childhood, first helping with studies, then being forced into sword training. And after Adrian's father died, Hans was burdened with managing the estate, eventually becoming Adrian's double, while the real Count wasted his life drinking and chasing pleasure. And now, instead of Adrian, Hans stands on the battlefield. Though Hans had accepted everything that came with the role, he never imagined it would lead him here. At last, Hans and the soldiers reach the location where the lights were seen, and with visibility still poor, one soldier suggests retreating, but Hans drifts into thoughts about the lives of commoners and whether an afterlife even exists. Just as they prepare to leave, a soldier is suddenly struck down, and in that instant they realize they have walked straight into an ambush. Chaos erupts, and amidst the confusion Hans is impaled from behind by a spear, collapsing to the ground, as the reality sinks that he is about to die as nothing more than a substitute for another man. As his consciousness fades, he wonders if there exists a second life where he could finally live as himself, not as someone else, and with that thought Hans closes his eyes and slips into darkness. Then suddenly his eyes open again, and before him kneels a young maid, Meline, crying as she begs, addressing him as her lord, leaving Hans confused by her presence and her youthful appearance. He notices a whip in his hand, and as he looks around he realizes he is inside a luxurious room, and when he turns toward the mirror he sees the reflection of Count Callista staring back at him, causing him to drop the cane and grab his face in disbelief. He rushes toward Meline with concern, but she instinctively raises her hands, expecting punishment, forcing Hans to stop himself. And instead he asks her what year it is, learning from her that it is the year 853. The realization strikes him immediately. He has somehow taken over the body of Count Callista, his former master, and not only that, time itself has reversed by 15 years. Overwhelmed, Hans falls onto the bed, questioning reality, surrounded by luxury, feeling the softness of a body that has never known labor, delicate and untouched by hardship. Trying to regain control, he orders Meline to leave, and as she walks away, he notices the clear marks of repeated beatings on her legs, revealing the abuse she suffered under Adrian, prompting Hans to admit that Adrian was the worst and most wasteful lord imaginable, someone who tormented servants for trivial reasons and treated them like toys. While Hans had always been the one cleaning up the aftermath, suddenly remembering something, Hans rushes out and opens a room that should have been his, only to find it turned into a storage space, leaving him stunned, knowing without doubt that this was where he lived for over 20 years. As confusion sets in, a servant named Claude calls out to him, questioning why the Lord is in the servants' quarters, and Claude, along with Meline, were once Hans's closest companions, just as he remembers them. Hans asks Claude where the servant named Hans is, but the question leaves Claude completely puzzled, having never heard of such a person, and no matter how Hans tries to explain, Claude cannot understand, leading to a bitter realization that in this timeline Hans does not exist. Soon rumors spread among the servants about the Lord's strange behavior, waking early instead of sleeping until afternoon, acting completely unlike his former self, and as two maids whisper about it, Hans suddenly appears behind them, startling them before apologizing and asking them to summon the nanny. A week passes since Hans took over Adrian's body, and he comes to accept that he must now live as Adrian. When the nanny arrives, she expresses concern over his lack of sleep, and Hans admits that even when he opens his eyes, it feels like he never truly rested. And when she offers to prepare breakfast, he declines, instead deciding to visit his mother. Though surprised, the nanny agrees, and Hans makes his way to her chambers, where both his mother Owen and his sister Regina are shocked to see him, with Regina questioning his presence so early, prompting Owen to scold her, though it is understandable given Adrian's past indifference toward his family. Owen welcomes him warmly, revealing that 3 years prior, after the former Count's death, she had fallen bedridden from grief, leaving only Adrian, Owen, and Regina as the remnants of House Callista, a family once prosperous but now fallen into decline, forced to lease troops just to survive. In the future, Hans remembers, Owen dies, and Regina inherits a house drowning in debt. Holding his mother's hand, Hans promises to visit more often, though she tells him not to overburden himself, knowing the stress of managing the estate. After leaving her room, Hans resolves to restore the estate properly, but just then, the butler Allman informs him that a man named Flynn has arrived. Hans recalls that Alman is a loyal servant who always protected others, even taking punishment himself, though around this time in the past, Alman would resign and be replaced by Sid, an incompetent butler who contributed to the family's downfall. Determined to prevent this, Hans meets with Flynn, the territory's administrator, a cruel man who treated servants like slaves, and as expected, Flynn proposes replacing Alman with someone else, urging that Alman be dismissed immediately. Hans is stunned as Flynn continues, recommending a man named Sid, claiming he is capable and trustworthy. But before Flynn can go further, Hans cuts him off, anger rising as he demands confirmation of what he just heard, questioning whether Flynn truly intends to fire Alman. As Flynn notices Hans's reaction, he tries to smooth things over, blaming a misunderstanding, then reaches into his pocket, pulls out 10 gold coins and presses them into Hans's hand. Hans is left stunned and disgusted by what he hears. Flynn casually says he does not want the boy to dirty his hands with what is about to happen because he already has a simple solution prepared, a charge of embezzlement. As if nothing is wrong, Flynn tells Hans that he has already prepared the records for him. Hans remains silent, staring down at the 10 gold coins resting in his palm. A poor family usually survives on 10 silver coins a month, which means 10 gold coins amount to nearly 20 months of living expenses for a commoner. Since 1 gold coin equals 20 silver coins and Flynn's official income as Callista's administrator is limited, Hans quickly realizes where that money came from. It is stolen money taken from the people. The thought leaves Hans deeply disappointed, because Adrian had been accepting embezzled money as bribes, and in return men like Flynn had been free to manipulate the estate however they pleased. At that moment, Hans finally understands that Flynn did not resign in the past, he was driven out. Everyone must have known he had been falsely accused, yet no one spoke, and Hans himself had been too young at the time to know the truth. The weight of everything now coming to light leaves Hans disgusted. In a low voice, he calls for Oswald, the night bodyguard. Then, in a complete reversal, Hans orders Oswald to arrest Flynn immediately. He states that Flynn made corrupt requests of him and falsely accused one of his servants, and for those crimes, he is to be locked in the dungeon at once. Oswald obeys without hesitation, while Flynn stands there in total disbelief, his mouth hanging open. He calls out to Hans and tries to reason with him, but Hans ignores him completely as Oswald drags him away. Hans drops the 10 gold coins onto the table and wonders why he was made to enter Adrian's body. He may not know the full reason, but one thing is clear, Adrian caused countless people pain. And Hans is not Adrian, so he has no intention of sitting back and letting history repeat itself. Out in the mansion hall, Oswald drags Flynn toward the dungeon, telling him to walk properly and calling him scum. He does not even care what Flynn's exact crime was. Even Flynn himself is still struggling to believe what is happening, unable to accept that he is really being taken to the dungeon. In a decaying house led by a wasteful lord, Oswald is the only knight who remained, and Flynn always saw Adrian as a fool, easy to manipulate. Now, as he is being arrested, Flynn starts wondering if Adrian is finally trying to show some pride. What he does not realize is that the one inside Adrian's body is no longer the same useless boy. Even so, Flynn remains confident that Hans will eventually suffer, because the world is never that simple. Oswald throws him into the dungeon cell without the slightest respect for his former rank. Flynn complains that he is being handled too roughly, but Oswald tells him to shut his mouth until the Lord decides his fate. Oswald is the son of a knight who served the former count, and when all the other knights left, he alone remained out of loyalty. Inside the cell, Flynn convinces himself that he can still sweet-talk the Lord and manipulate him again. He imagines getting Oswald fired and restoring everything to how it used to be. In his mind, Adrian is still just a lazy and foolish 15-year-old with terrible judgment, someone he has always been able to push into raising taxes or doing whatever he wanted. Flynn assumes this is nothing more than a momentary bad mood, and that a little flattery will have the boy back under his control in no time. He even starts rehearsing what he will say once the Lord comes, planning to laugh, beg, or kneel if he has to. But right in the middle of that pathetic practice, Hans arrives. Just from the way Hans stands, Flynn begins to wonder whether this is really the same boy he used to manipulate. Even so, Flynn drops to his knees at once and begs for mercy. Hans coldly tells him there is no point in begging, because from this moment on, crimes in the territory will be judged through trials. The moment Flynn hears the word trial, real fear overtakes him. Hans turns to leave, and Flynn immediately starts pleading again, trying the same manipulative tricks he always used, reminding Hans how loyal he had been. But Hans keeps walking as if he hears nothing. Flynn, once just a commoner who rose through the ranks and became Callista's administrator, now finds himself standing in a courtroom before a judge. He is formally charged with bribery, embezzlement, and breach of trust. For those offenses, he faces asset confiscation and possible imprisonment. The trial shocks the people of the territory and serves as a warning to every lazy or corrupt administrator under Callista's rule. Even the servants in the mansion are stunned, because it has been so long since there was last a real trial in the land. Hans then gathers all the servants together, and many of them are already trembling, convinced they are about to be punished. Almond tells Hans that everyone has assembled, and with pity in his voice, Hans asks them how he has performed as their lord so far. Because they are the people closest to him, he believes they would know the truth best. The question leaves the servants speechless, unable to understand what the Lord is trying to do. At that moment, their only hope is that they are not about to be beaten. When no answer comes, Hans speaks again, and what he does next shocks everyone in the room. He lowers his head and apologizes to the servants. Hans admits that he lashed out at them and caused them pain over foolish matters. The servants immediately begin whispering among themselves, trying to make sense of what they are seeing. Hans continues, saying that one apology cannot erase everything he did in the past, but he still wants to start making amends. He confesses that he has acted irresponsibly as the head of the house, but promises that from this moment on, he will turn Callista into a better place for them to live. And if he is going to do that, then the first step is to care properly for the people inside his own castle. Hans says he intends to fix everything that is wrong, though he admits the process may be chaotic at first, and asks the servants to trust him and follow him. By the time he is done, the servants are left in total disbelief. After the meeting, Claude and Meline talk privately about what just happened. Meline points out that the Lord beat her only days ago, yet now he seems like a completely different person, making her wonder whether anyone can really change that fast. Back in Hans's chamber, he thanks Almond for his work and tells him he may leave. But Almond stays behind, lowers his head, and thanks Hans instead. Hans is startled by that, and Almond explains that he knows the Lord stood up for him when Flynn tried to falsely accuse him. Hans quickly tells him to raise his head, reminding him that they have been together a long time and that he only did what was right. Then Hans takes Almond's hand and tells him that if anyone ever tries to wrongfully accuse him again, he is to report it directly. Hearing that, Almond is forced to admit to himself that the Lord has truly changed. He has served Hans for over 10 years, and though the body and face before him have not changed, the person inside clearly has. Because of that new resolve, Almond pledges his allegiance and promises to follow him from now on. Later that day, Hans stands by the window of his room, reflecting on everything that has happened. He realizes that he has not merely been given a second chance, but also the title of Count Callista, which means he now governs the entire territory. On top of that, he holds knowledge from 15 years into the future. Thankfully, he already knows how to run things, because in his previous life, he was effectively doing exactly that. Now he plans to use that knowledge to his advantage. As a first step, he decides that he must protect the people dear to him, his remaining family and the servants. Beyond that, he wants everyone in the land to live the life they choose, free from the restrictions of status. But Hans also knows he cannot achieve any of that unless he improves the territory itself. So he begins searching his memories for something from the future that could help. Then, all at once, he remembers the rumors about the dragon's lair. His face lights up with excitement as he realizes he has found his jackpot. The dragon's lair is exactly what he needs to find. With that revelation, Hans immediately throws himself into action. He organizes his servants and begins the search for the dragon's lair. After days of fruitless searching, Oswald urges him to rest, pointing out how exhausted he looks. But Hans refuses to stop. He only takes the pouch of water Oswald offers, gulps it down, and apologizes for pushing everyone so hard. It has been days since Hans began accompanying his servants to inspect the territory, and he shows no sign of stopping. While to them it appears he is simply surveying the land, in truth he is secretly searching for the dragon's lair. Dragons are known as the mightiest of creatures and the most intelligent divine beings, each one nearly godlike, yet they vanished long ago, and whenever their lairs are discovered, they draw the attention of the entire world because such places are rumored to hold immense treasures. Hans knows that a dragon's lair exists somewhere within the mountain range, and in the current era, the Emperor of the Rosenbaum Empire is nothing more than a young puppet, while the true power lies with two great families, the Townsend family and the McCarthy family, who maintain a fragile balance. The Compton Mountains sit between their borders, and it is here that the dragon's lair will be discovered, triggering a conflict between the two houses over ownership, with the Callista territory lying along the border, eventually forcing the family to send troops in support of Townsend. Now that Hans has returned to the past, he has 15 years to find the lair before that future unfolds. Leaving his servants behind, he pushes deeper into the forest, driven by the knowledge that dragons are said to hoard mountains of gold and jewels, wealth enough to purchase an entire kingdom, and if he secures the lair first, it could stabilize the entire territory. The exact location remains unknown, though its discovery will spread far. and wide, said to have been found by a lost herbalist wandering through an oak forest, stumbling upon it purely by chance. And since the lair is supposedly easy to recognize, Hans believes he will know it when he sees it. Hours pass as he searches, but exhaustion quickly catches up, and he finds nothing, not even a clue, leaving him questioning whether the story of the herbalist was ever true. With the sun setting, he decides to head back, his fatigue reminding him just how weak Adrian's body is, and he resolves to train and strengthen it once he returns. Meanwhile, the servants call out for him, and Hans feels uneasy knowing he is pushing them too hard, briefly considering asking for help. Yet he abandons the thought, determined to keep the lair a secret, aware that revealing its existence could ignite a civil war. Lost in thought, his footing suddenly gives way and he slips off a cliff, crashing down and sustaining severe injuries, yet somehow surviving, left hanging midway as pain surges through his body, his ribs shattered, his vision fading as he struggles to think of a way back up. With great effort, he forces himself to move, and that is when he notices an opening in the cliff face. And from the formation alone, he immediately realizes that he has found the dragon's lair. The entrance sits absurdly in the middle of the cliff, suggesting it may have once been guarded, as dragons are known to have guardians that protect them, and the harsh terrain itself has kept the lair hidden all this time. Even after finding it, Hans is troubled by how he will return to the mountain top, knowing no one will be able to locate him here, and with death already on his mind, he steps into the lair's grand hall. At its center lies a glowing golden magic circle, and the moment he steps into it, his injuries vanish, his broken ribs restoring instantly. Hans is stunned, as the lair was supposed to be empty, and he wonders if the very space is enchanted with healing magic, realizing that this alone makes the place incredibly valuable. For a moment, his thoughts drift toward the possibilities, but he snaps himself back to focus, deciding to explore the lair thoroughly. With this discovery, Hans believes the lair could become his greatest asset, especially as someone who has returned to the past in another man's body. He soon finds 4 passageways branching out from the central hall, the structure resembling an intricate ant colony, and as he explores further, he discovers what appears to be a library. Knowing that dragons can take human form, he assumes the dragon once used this space to indulge in human habits, and from what he has seen so far, the lair resembles a human residence, complete with a bedroom, a study, and even a dressing room. There are no vast treasures as the rumors claimed, yet Hans is certain the lair's true value will reveal itself in time, with the healing hall already proving to be the most valuable feature he has found. He decides to name the central chamber the healing hall, impressed by the presence of healing magic, something that has nearly vanished from the world. Finally, he approaches the last unexplored room, and the moment he steps inside, he freezes in shock as a golden dragon lies before him. Unable to believe his eyes, he recalls that dragons have been extinct for over a century, leading him to assume it must be a corpse, yet its pristine, radiant condition makes him question that conclusion. As he reaches out and touches it, a blinding light erupts from the dragon, forcing him to step back as the light pours into his body, and at the same time, a voice echoes within his mind. Before he can comprehend what is happening, he finds himself standing before a man dressed in royal robes, emanating an overwhelming and unnatural presence, making it clear that he is no ordinary human. The man introduces himself as Safrid, revealing that he is the last head of the Gold Clan and the final dragon of the continent, leaving Hans stunned as he realizes he is standing before a dragon. When Hans questions whether he is the master of the lair, Safrid explains that the dragon he saw is merely an empty shell, while the voice he hears is the final magic left behind. He continues, describing how dragons, once superior beings, were consumed by internal conflicts over time, until only he remained. Though dragons are solitary by nature, Safrid admits he cannot accept the complete disappearance of dragon magic, and so he chose to pass down his knowledge and legacy to a worthy being who would discover his lair by fate. He reveals that he died in the year 354, leaving behind a spell designed to endure for 500 years, and if no one had found him within that time, both his body and dragon magic would have vanished forever. While he would have accepted that outcome, he expresses gratitude that Hans has become his successor, hoping that dragon magic will continue to exist for future generations. Hans protests, admitting he has no knowledge of magic and that even mages are now rare, making it nearly impossible for him to learn, but Safrid simply laughs, reminding him that he has already been chosen. Pointing to Hans's right chest, Safrid touches him, and in an instant Hans finds himself back inside the lair. Looking around, he sees that the dragon's body has completely disintegrated, and realization dawns on him he has inherited a dragon's heart, now residing on the right side of his chest. Alongside his human heart, he senses another presence, like a hazy yet powerful source of magic, as Safrid's knowledge begins to flood into him through this new heart. Though overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information, Hans grasps one crucial fact: he can now use dragon tongue magic. Unlike human magic, which requires long incantations and activation phrases, Dragon Tongue Magic activates with a single word. And since it draws power directly from a dragon's heart, Hans knows the heart left behind by Saffred is more than enough. Using this newfound power, Hans activates the spell with a single word, and through Dragon Tongue Magic, he ascends back to the mountaintop with the command Fly. However, Hans exhausts all his mana just to reach the mountaintop, as the dragon heart within him is still unstable, limiting the amount of mana he can use, though he remains unconcerned, knowing the heart will gradually adapt to his body, and in time, he will wield magic that rivals divine power. Reuniting with his servants who had been searching anxiously since his disappearance, Hans is quickly surrounded as they rush to check on his condition, and not long after, the group prepares to return to the estate. Hans reflects on how he gained far more than he originally sought, setting out only to find a dragon's lair, yet returning as the successor of a dragon, and recalling the dragon's words about the spell lasting 500 years. He calculates the years, and realizes that if he had arrived just 1 year later, the dragon's legacy would have vanished forever. He remembers that in his previous life, the lair was not discovered until 15 years later, meaning the magic within it had already been lost. And in the current era, most mages struggle to surpass the first or second circle in their entire lives, while those who reach the 5th circle are hailed as archmages, yet dragons are born at the 9th circle, a level far beyond human reach. Now, with a dragon's power, Hans realizes that what was once impossible may no longer be out of reach. Upon returning to the estate, he is greeted by his worried sister, who immediately scolds him for disappearing and causing concern, noticing his torn clothes and questioning whether he encountered bandits, though Hans reassures her that he is unharmed, admitting he was injured before but has since recovered. Oswald drops to his knees, blaming himself for failing to protect his lord, and even Hans's sister directs her frustration toward him, but Hans quickly calms the situation, assuring everyone that he is fine. Finally, alone in his room, Hans lets out a sigh of relief, recognizing that both Oswald and the butler Allman have remained by his side out of loyalty, and he is grateful to have people like them supporting him. He summons Allman, who arrives promptly, and Hans apologizes for calling him so late before asking about the servant list and salary ledger he had requested earlier, with Allman confirming that everything is ready, though he questions whether Hans truly intends to review them at such an hour, especially after hearing about his accident. Hans insists he is fine and orders the documents to be brought, remaining firm despite Allman's concern, as he prioritizes the well-being of his servants and believes the matter cannot wait, leaving Allman no choice but to comply. Moments later, Hans reaches into his pocket and pulls out several gold coins, asking Allman if he is familiar with Grace. Meanwhile, Claude visits a market vendor named Lone to place an order, handing her a list that leaves her visibly surprised. And when Claude asks if fulfilling it will be difficult, she assures him it will not, explaining that her reaction stems from happiness rather than concern. Hans's new policies have transformed the territory, taxes have been reduced, and orders from the estate have increased, allowing the people to finally feel that life is worth living, something they never believed possible before. Lone provides Claude with a receipt and promises delivery by evening, then unexpectedly gives him 2 apples as a gesture of appreciation, believing that the servant's dedication is what helped change the lord into a kinder person. Claude returns to the estate and meets Melanie, who had been gathering herbs, and with a cheerful expression he shares one of the apples with her, explaining where he got it, which leaves her shocked, as Lone was always known for being stingy. He goes on to explain that many things have changed. Flynn has been punished along with other corrupt officials, and Hans personally reviewed the estate's ledgers to identify them, even returning illegally collected taxes to the citizens, including the servants. As a result, the servants now enjoy better wages, proper breaks, and new clothing, while the castle has become more accessible, allowing them to spend time outside freely, just as Claude and Melanie are doing now. Claude notices that Melanie speaks kindly of the Lord, and reminds her of how poorly he treated them in the past, finding it hard to believe that someone could change so quickly. Yet Melanie admits that whenever she sees Hans now, she feels as though her earlier judgments may have been too harsh, and with everything that has happened, she wants to give him another chance. Claude teases her, wondering if her forgiveness is due to his looks, but she denies it, and the two begin walking back to the castle, discussing how Hans is rarely seen these days. Although he claims to be conducting inspections, in truth, Hans has been secretly returning to the dragon's lair, where he spends his time training his magic. Nearly a month has passed since he inherited the dragon's power, and through consistent practice, he has learned to cast spells such as fireballs and shields, steadily improving with each passing day. However, he finds it inconvenient to travel by horse to the lair every time he wishes to train, even though the lair itself, reinforced with magic, serves as the perfect training ground, immune to destruction no matter how intense his practice becomes. Hans begins to consider teleportation magic, known as the warp gate, which would allow him to instantly travel to a designated location, though it is a high-level spell belonging to the 7th circle, far beyond his current ability. At present, Hans can only manage 2nd or 3rd circle magic, which is already impressive considering even the Empire's Grand Mage has not surpassed the 5th circle. Yet to advance further, he knows he must first master a 3rd circle spell known as Blink, a short-range teleportation technique. He has attempted it repeatedly for days, failing each time, but when he tries once more, the spell finally succeeds, allowing him to shift slightly forward from his original position. As he begins to celebrate this small victory, the world around him suddenly turns white, and a strange discomfort rises from his dragon heart, prompting him to look up and see Saffred standing before him. The dragon acknowledges Hans's progress, stating that he has moved beyond the beginner stage, and as a reward, Saffred unlocks a new section of the lair to aid his growth, explaining that the further Hans advances, the more valuable resources he will gain. Hans questions why the treasures were hidden, and Saffred reveals it was to prevent greedy individuals from accessing them, urging Hans to continue growing so that dragon magic may endure. After this encounter, Hans realizes Saffred spoke the truth, as he discovers a previously concealed room hidden by magic, now revealed before him, filled with treasures, confirming the rumors of a dragon's lair overflowing with wealth. Among the treasures, he finds a book detailing artifacts, objects permanently infused with magic, now exceedingly rare due to the decline of magic itself, and at his current level, Hans understands he is still incapable of creating such items. As he examines the room further, it becomes clear that every object within it is, in fact, an artifact. There are a total of 10 artifacts displayed within the room, each accompanied by a book explaining its properties in detail, and with the help of these records, Hans carefully selects the ones most useful to him at this moment. The first artifact he chooses is Spring Afternoon, an item said to have been crafted by a 7th circle archmage for his ailing wife, containing healing magic, and though its healing is not especially powerful, it enhances vitality, making it ideal for his sick mother. The second artifact he selects is Dance of Shadows, created by the red dragon Berestein, and despite its simple appearance, it proves incredibly effective, as Hans equips it and a faint red aura envelops his body. The artifact carries an advanced concealment spell, rendering the wearer nearly undetectable, and when Hans stands before a mirror, his reflection does not appear, while even his footsteps vanish into silence, leaving him feeling weightless as if his body itself has lost its presence. Excited by how useful these artifacts are, Hans proceeds to choose a third, known as Breath of Earth, shaped like a serpent and uniquely crafted by Saffred himself. This artifact grants him what he has been lacking, the ability to teleport, allowing him to use a warp function that is preset to the lair's location. And with this, Hans realizes he can move between the castle and the lair freely without drawing attention from his sister or Alman. With distance no longer a problem, he becomes confident that his training will progress much faster, and he admits to himself that he is enjoying every moment of it. After finishing his training for the day, Hans mounts his horse and begins his journey back to the castle, fully aware that this will likely be his final ride through the Compton Mountains, as the artifact now allows him to teleport at will. He feels relieved knowing the mountains are deserted, but before that thought can settle, he encounters a group of soldiers. Surprised to see troops in the area, Hans introduces himself as the lord of the territory and questions why they have entered his land without prior notice. The knight leading them responds with open rudeness, addressing Hans as nothing more than a child, remarking that the rumors about Callista's young lord appear to be true, before introducing himself as Count Pete Ross, commander of the 1st Imperial Knights. Hans does not take kindly to the remark, calmly reminding Pete that despite coming from the capital, they share equal rank and authority as counts, and therefore deserve proper formal respect regardless of age. Pete is taken aback by Hans's boldness, and Hans follows by asking the purpose of his presence in Callista territory. Pressed for time, Pete reveals that Count Rodriguez has initiated a rebellion, and they are pursuing him for execution, presenting a stamped imperial decree as proof, which also demands Hans's cooperation, requiring him to use Callista's resources to assist in the search. Hearing the name, Hans immediately recalls Lakia de Rodriguez, a prodigy who became a swordmaster at the age of 16, only to be dragged into his family's alleged treason and meet a tragic end. In truth, Lakia had once been close friends with the emperor during childhood, but everything changed when the prince ascended the throne, as the powerful McCarthy and Townsend families manipulated the young ruler, eliminating those who could support him, leading to Rodriguez being falsely accused. He was executed, and although his innocence was proven 5 years later, his entire family had already been wiped out, leaving behind only regret for the loss of a brilliant young talent. With this knowledge, Hans resolves that this time he must save Lakia. Noticing Hans's silence, Pete calls his attention and informs him that Lakia was last seen injured and fleeing into the mountains. Hans agrees to cooperate but suggests halting the search for the day due to the late hour, proposing that they resume at dawn. Pete arrogantly insists his men are capable of continuing, but Hans points out the reality of the Compton Mountains, explaining that the terrain is far too harsh for mounted searches, especially with heavy armor, and that the soldiers are already exhausted. He assures Pete that the only practical approach is to begin fresh the next morning, and with careful reasoning he manages to convince him. Hans recalls that in his previous life, a similar situation occurred when Callista troops assisted Townsend, and he knows firsthand how unforgiving the terrain is, admitting that even finding the lair required both prior knowledge and sheer luck, making it nearly impossible to locate a wounded man in such conditions within a single day. Once Pete agrees to postpone, Hans immediately sets out to find Lakia himself, using magic to scan the surrounding area, and after an intense effort, he successfully locates him. Riding to the location, he finds Lakia unconscious and severely wounded, his condition critical and with no proper healing abilities yet. Hans resorts to using the Spring Afternoon artifact, placing the ring on Lakia's finger so its vitality-enhancing effects can take hold. He then casts a feathering spell to lighten Lakia's body, making it easier to carry him onto his horse, having already decided that he will be the one to save him. With Lakia secured, Hans rides back toward the castle at full speed, but as he approaches, he notices that Pete and his knights have already arrived, with the Imperial flag now hanging at the entrance. Remaining calm, Hans acts quickly, activating the concealment artifact, causing both himself and Lakia to vanish from sight. The town is already flooded with wanted posters bearing Lakia's image, detailing his navy blue eyes and gray hair, leaving the citizens in shock over the sudden development. Inside the castle, Pete continues his arrogant behavior, mocking the condition of the estate and claiming it would be better suited as an inn, laughing along with his knights as the servants, including Claude, serve them. His rudeness extends to the staff as well, as he criticizes Claude over something as trivial as water, forcing Claude to bow and apologize. Regina enters the hall, urging Pete to refrain from unnecessary aggression, reminding him that the castle is accommodating him and his men without preparation, and asking him to overlook any shortcomings. Pete responds with disdain, questioning her identity, and upon learning who she is, he expresses disappointment that the estate is run by children, claiming that matters of importance should be handled by adults, even going so far as to call her a disgrace. This provokes Regina, who firmly reminds him that she stands as the representative of the land and deserves respect, surprising Pete once again as he concludes that arrogance runs in the Callista family. Frustrated, Regina can only wish for her brother's presence. Meanwhile, Hans has already slipped into his room unnoticed, thanks to the artifact's power, having even passed by Regina during her confrontation with Pete. He resolves to deal with the situation once Lakia is secured, but he knows the circumstances have grown far more complicated, with wanted posters everywhere and the castle now filled with knights, leaving Lakia with nowhere to hide. With Lakia's condition worsening, Hans becomes increasingly concerned that he may not survive without proper treatment. At that moment, Meline enters the room to clean, unaware that anyone is inside, and upon seeing Hans, she is startled and quickly apologizes, explaining that she did not know he was there. Hans does not take offense at Meline's sudden entrance, instead gently telling her to stay quiet, and realizing she has arrived at the perfect moment, he decides to make use of it, asking her to bring Almond to his room without letting anyone notice. It is not long before Almond arrives surprised to find Hans already back at the castle, since everyone believed he was still away on inspection, and though Almond urges him to head to the lobby where he is needed, Hans puts that aside and tells both of them that there is something important he must show them first. He leads them to the bed, where the wounded Lakia lies unconscious, and both servants are left stunned at the sight of the wanted man hidden inside Hans's room. Almond asks if Hans captured the supposed traitor by himself, but Hans immediately denies that Lakia is a traitor, explaining that he has been falsely accused, though he cannot reveal every detail yet, and instead makes his position clear: he intends to protect him. Hans asks for their help, admitting he cannot keep Lakia safe alone, and the request leaves both of them speechless. He knows exactly what they must be thinking, that Callista is only a rural house with no real ties to the imperial family. So involving themselves with a powerful name like Rodriguez makes no sense, and on top of that, Almond and Meline are servants people expected to obey nobles, which means they could just as easily report everything to Pete, another noble with greater authority behind him. Even with all those risks, Hans turns to Meline and says he wants to assign her to his room so she can help care for Lakia, but Meline quickly reminds him that she knows nothing about treating wounds. Hans tells her that she does not need to handle anything complicated, only to clean Lakia's injuries and make sure he is fed, promising that he will reward her generously if she helps. He then turns to Almond and asks for a much harder favor. He wants him to find a corpse that resembles Lakia, a young man with a similar build and gray hair, while matching eye color would help, though it is not absolutely necessary. Even Almond is shaken by the request, and Hans understands why, knowing full well he is asking for something extremely difficult, but he makes it clear that he must save Lakia. He also knows the servants still have reason to doubt him, because no one would easily believe that a spoiled lord who once terrorized his staff could suddenly become a different person, and he worries that what he is asking now could even drive them to betray him. Still, Hans has no choice but to trust that they can believe he has truly changed, and he tells Almond that for now, they only need to trust him. At last, Almond breaks the silence, acknowledging that even among nobles there are ranks and that an imperial decree stands above nearly all else. Yet despite that, he says he serves only one person, Count Vonalista. Hans is genuinely stunned by the depth of Almond's loyalty to the family, and Almond then asks whether Hans is acting under outside pressure or coercion, wanting to know if this choice to protect Lakia truly came from Hans himself. Hans understands why Almond would ask, especially after Flynn once claimed that a boy of his age could easily be manipulated, and Almond makes it clear that before agreeing, he must confirm that no one else is pushing Hans into this decision. Seeing such unwavering loyalty only makes Hans resent even more the fact that Adrian once drove away someone so dependable. Hans finally answers, assuring Almond that this decision is entirely his own, and adding that saving Lakia will benefit both the land and the people who live on it. With that confirmation, Almond bows his head and promises to secure the corpse Hans requested, and following his lead, Meline also pledges to do her best. Hans is relieved that he managed to win their support. Not long after, Imperial Knights attempt to search Owen's room, but Regina blocks the entrance and firmly tells them that it is their mother's chamber, ordering them to leave. Thankfully, Hans arrives in time to intervene, demanding to know why armed soldiers are trying to force their way into the bedridden countess's room. The soldier claims that House Callista agreed to cooperate, but Hans admits only to that much and reminds him that cooperation never included searching the castle, as providing lodging and manpower already satisfies what was asked of them. He then presses the soldier further, asking where in the imperial decree it states that the castle itself must be searched, and with no answer left, the man has no choice but to back down. Regina is relieved to see her brother and asks whether he is alright, given that a wanted man is supposedly roaming their land, and Hans reassures her that he is fine while apologizing for arriving late. He also praises her for handling Pete so well, which catches Regina off guard, since Hans was supposed to be away when she confronted him. Realizing he has said too much, Hans quickly redirects the conversation before she can question him further, suggesting that they go inside and check on their mother. Inside the room, Owen warns both of them to be careful because of the fugitive moving through their territory, and she urges them to cooperate with the Imperial Knights so they do not bring trouble upon themselves, unaware that Hans has already stepped far beyond that line. Hans calmly tells her that he has already provided troops to assist in the search, and that with the fugitive badly wounded, it should not be long before he is found. He then lies, saying that while he was out inspecting the land, he met an elderly foreign woman, and after helping her, she gave him a ring imbued with special energy. Hans tells his mother that wearing it should gradually restore her health, which surprises Owen, since she never thought her son was the sort to believe in such things. Hans says that whether he believes it or not does not matter, because he still wants her to have the beautiful ring, and as he slips it onto her finger, the artifact immediately begins to work. A bright smile appears on Owen's face almost at once as she admits she already feels better, and even Regina is visibly shocked by the change. Owen studies the gem closely and recognizes it as a yellow sapphire, easily realizing that such a ring must be worth a fortune. Though Hans alone knows the terrifying truth that the artifact is worth more than an entire castle, and that chaos would erupt if anyone discovered its real value. A day later, Lakia is still recovering, and Hans and Meline have been taking turns guarding the room, with Meline watching over him during the day while Hans takes the night shift. Having lived as a servant in his previous life, Hans is already used to staying awake through the night, though now he feels far less fatigue thanks to the dragon heart within him. Even so, his concern is not for himself but for Lakia, because although he has cleaned away the blood and pus, the wound is still far too deep, and he has no idea whether simply leaving it alone will be enough. Then he hears 5 knocks on the door, the signal he and Meline arranged so they can identify each other safely without risking another servant discovering their secret. Meline enters carrying herbs, and Hans is surprised, but she explains that since Lakia's external wounds are severe, she brought medicinal herbs that help with disinfection and recovery. Hans is even more surprised by that and asks how she knows so much about herbs, and Meline reveals that her father was an herbalist and that she used to watch him work. Hearing this, Hans remembers that Meline once mentioned to the other servants that she knew how to prepare herbal teas, though he had never realized her knowledge went far beyond that. Melanie crushes the herbs, applies them carefully to Lakia's wounds and dresses them properly, and Hans is relieved to have someone like her by his side, someone who is practically a healer. Watching her work, he can only hope Lakia will recover. Days pass, yet Lakia still shows no sign of waking, and after 5 full days of effort, he remains unconscious. Later that same day, Melanie returns to the room and is horrified to find no sign of Lakia anywhere, immediately rushing off to find Hans. While unknown to her, Lakia has already regained consciousness and is hiding behind a chair. From his hiding place, Lakia hears the troops outside making an important announcement. They have supposedly found his body in the mountain range. The news shocks him, but without his noticing, Hans is already in the room, having approached silently with the help of his concealment artifact. Hans finally reveals himself by calling Lakia's name and expressing surprise that he is awake, though in truth he already knew, because the dragon heart has sharpened his senses enough for him to notice the change in Lakia's breathing. Hans also understands why Lakia pretended to remain unconscious, because for a fugitive on the run, waking up in a stranger's room, being cared for by an unknown boy and girl, would naturally make anyone suspicious. Knowing all that, Hans is not surprised when Lakia keeps his distance and points a charcoal poker at him, demanding to know his name and whether he is connected to the troops outside. Hans tries to approach him calmly, but Lakia warns him not to come any closer. So Hans tells him to relax, reminding him that he is still seriously injured and suggests that they sit and talk so he can explain everything. Lakia finally agrees, though he keeps the weapon beside him, prepared in case Hans makes a wrong move. Hans understands that the way he speaks and carries himself will determine whether Lakia believes he is not a threat, so he carefully explains everything. And after listening, the first thing Lakia questions is the corpse. He is shocked to learn that the body the soldiers found was a fake arranged by Hans, and Hans calmly confirms it, explaining that he dressed the corpse in Lakia's clothes and even placed his signet ring on it, apologizing for using his belongings without permission. Lakia points out that Pete has seen his face before and would not be fooled so easily, but Hans explains that he accounted for that leaving the body in a swamp during the rainy August season, so it would decompose naturally, knowing the exhausted knights and Pete's impatience would lead them to close the case quickly. With that, Hans successfully deceived Pete and his men. He then advises Lakia to remain hidden for 5 years, assuring him that his name will be cleared by then, even suggesting he stay within the territory during that time. This immediately puts Lakia on guard, questioning how Hans knows he was falsely accused, suspecting he may be involved in the situation. But Hans refuses to reveal everything just yet, even when Lakia presses him about what will happen in 5 years. All Hans can do is ask for his trust, but Lakia refuses, making it clear that while he appreciates the help, he cannot entrust his life to someone who withholds crucial information. Hans understands this hesitation, knowing Lakia has been betrayed and branded a traitor, leaving him unable to trust anyone, and realizing he must handle this more carefully, he takes another approach. He casts an illusion spell, altering Lakia's hair and eye color instantly. Lakia is left stunned, unable to believe what he just witnessed, as such a spell is advanced magic, and Hans performed it effortlessly without any incantation, something even Imperial Court mages struggle to achieve. Seeing Lakia speechless, Hans calls his attention back and admits there are many things he cannot explain yet, while also acknowledging Lakia's need to be cautious, but assures him that he has no intention of harming him or the Emperor. He asks Lakia once more to believe him, and after a long silence, Lakia finally agrees to trust him, at least for now. Hans is relieved, noticing that Lakia's hostility has softened, though he recalls hearing that Lakia was once gentle, and realizes that everything he has endured has changed him. He briefly imagines himself in Lakia's place, cornered and hunted, understanding exactly why he reacts this way. Soon after, Pete delivers the news of Lakia's supposed death to the Emperor, expecting satisfaction, but instead finds the Emperor unusually reserved. Pete reminds him that Lakia had supposedly planned to assassinate him and his family through poisoning, and though the Emperor forces a reaction to acknowledge Pete's success, once Pete leaves, he collapses in grief, clutching his head as he wishes things had turned out differently. In that moment, the Emperor quietly vows to restore Lakia's honor. Back in Calista, Lakia slowly begins adjusting to his new life, introduced to others as Hans's personal guard. During a meeting in the study, Lakia stands alongside the others, while Regina remains cautious of him, quietly asking Alman whether Lakia can be trusted, and Alman reassures her, maintaining the cover story that Hans found him during one of his inspections. Regina admits nothing is wrong on the surface, but something about the way Lakia carries himself makes her uneasy, as he feels more like a noble than a mere guard, and she cannot understand why someone like him would end up in a remote place like Calista. The two shift their focus, wondering why Hans called for the meeting, as neither of them knows the reason. Meanwhile, Lakia observes everything closely, impressed by how carefully Hans has concealed his identity, knowing that only Hans, Meline, and Alman are aware of the truth. He feels uneasy about the people in the castle, but the one he watches most closely is Hans himself, surprised by how competently he runs the estate despite taking responsibility at such a young age. The elaborate plan with the fake corpse, along with the way Hans manages both the estate and its people, leaves Lakia with the impression that Hans is more mature than he is. He also notices how smoothly the castle operates, with servants carrying out their duties happily, something rarely seen even in the capital, making it hard to believe that everything is being managed by a 15-year-old. The only question that lingers in Lakia's mind is who Hans truly is. 10 minutes into the meeting, Hans presents a bold proposal, revealing his plan to establish a bank. The announcement shocks everyone, and Lakia immediately reacts, warning that starting a bank requires immense capital and has ruined many who attempted it. Hans remains calm, explaining that the true challenge is not capital or land, but building a capable team, emphasizing the need for individuals skilled in asset management, investment evaluation, accounting, and security. He admits that Callista lacks the connections to recruit such talent, which is why he proposes creating an academy to train people within the territory itself. He outlines a system divided into 2 tracks, accounting and security, and as he explains, Lakia realizes that Hans has thought through every detail, though he still doubts the practicality of the plan. Regina then raises a critical concern, pointing out that commoners would not be able to afford tuition, since education is typically reserved for nobles. Hans acknowledges her concern and reveals that he has no intention of charging tuition at all. This surprises even Alman, but Hans clarifies further, explaining that the academy's attendees will not be treated as students, but as trainees, and instead of paying to learn, they will be paid while they train. This revelation leaves everyone in shock, as Hans calmly confirms his plan to compensate commoners during their education. Shortly after, Alman gathers the servants and explains the new initiative, outlining the academy's role in supporting the future Callista Bank, and informs them that the first group of trainees will be selected from among the staff. He invites those interested to step forward, and Claude is the first to speak, asking whether they will truly be paid during training, and Alman confirms it, though he adds that their current wages will be reduced during the training period, assuring them it will not affect their standard of living. The servants begin whispering among themselves, many already eager to join, while even those less confident academically consider entering the security track. Claude is amazed by everything Hans has done, though he struggles to understand how commoners like them are supposed to learn subjects typically reserved for nobles. Meline reminds him that he is good with numbers and handles tasks well, encouraging him to give it a chance, though Claude remains doubtful of his abilities and questions whether it will truly make a difference. After thinking for a moment, Meline reveals something unexpected. She plans to leave the estate. Claude is shocked, and she explains that after helping Hans recently, he offered to sponsor her medical studies, something she initially felt was beyond her, but seeing the changes happening around her, she has decided to accept it. She recalls how Lakia thanked her for saving his life, and how that moment filled her with pride, making her realize she is capable of achieving far more. Even if it feels like too much, Meline still wants to try, and since she has chosen to take that chance, she urges Claude to do the same. Her words sink deep into him, and Claude begins to realize that she is right, finally deciding to enroll in the accounting class, though doubt still lingers in his heart, making him wonder whether he truly belongs there, whether he will only fail, and whether he should have simply stayed behind and enjoyed the salary that had only recently been raised for the servants. When Claude hands in his test paper to the instructor, Podier praises him for doing an excellent job, but Claude tries to brush it off, only for the instructor to tell him that what he did was genuinely impressive. Podier explains that while many people can handle basic arithmetic, bookkeeping is a completely different matter, and even the smartest nobles struggle with it, yet Claude managed it perfectly. He admits that he had his doubts when he was first appointed as an instructor, but Claude's performance has given him hope, and with complete confidence, he declares that Claude will grow into a great accountant. Claude is unsure at first, but then he remembers the sacrifices Hans is making so they can all become something better, and because of that, he decides he will give everything he has to improve. At the security training grounds, Hans is shocked to find the students being punished under Lakia's orders, while Lakia scolds them mercilessly and calls them useless. Apparently 30 minutes earlier, the students had arrived acting arrogant, speaking to Lakia however they pleased, until he taught them a harsh lesson by beating them down. And now that he has proven more than capable of being their instructor, they have no choice but to obey. Still, Lakia remains unimpressed, telling Hans that while the accounting division may have promise, the security division is full of thugs and lowlifes. and he believes trying to teach them will be a complete waste of time and effort. Realizing Lakia has no motivation to help, Hans pulls him aside to speak in private, reminding him of his qualifications and the fact that he once taught the emperor himself how to wield a sword. Lakia replies that he was only able to do that because the emperor actually wanted to learn, then asks if Hans is seriously comparing the king to commoners, but Hans tells him that is not the point. Hans explains that he is only making the comparison because Lakia is an exceptional teacher, and with Callista having no knight order of its own, and Oswald being the only remaining knight but already too old to instruct, there is no one more suited for the role. Then Hans says something that hits even harder, that the king is no different from commoners, because people are simply people, whether noble or not, and the real difference comes down to whether someone recognizes their potential and helps them grow. And in this situation, Hans believes Lakia is the best person to do exactly that. Those words strike Lakia deeply, making him realize that Hans carries even more conviction than he had given him credit for. Lakia finally says that he will need more time and resources, and Hans immediately assures him that he is willing to provide whatever support is necessary. At that point, Lakia notices that Hans has become much more relaxed around him, no longer carrying the same nervousness he had when they first met. And when he points this out, Hans admits that he now sees Lakia as someone reliable, which is why he feels comfortable speaking so openly. Lakia has had enough of Hans's compliments and quickly heads back to the training grounds. When he arrives, he is surprised, and at the same time impressed, to see that most of the students are still holding the exact same stance he left them in before walking away with Hans. He then remembers what Hans told him, that people remain just people until someone notices their potential, and a faint smile appears on his face as he finally decides to give everything he has to training these so-called lowlifes. He orders the students back onto their feet and tells them that what they need is not just muscle or bravado, but grit and persistence, adding that the fact they stayed even after punishment shows real promise, and urges them not to forget that lesson. With that, Lakia throws himself fully into training them. He had once assumed the next 5 years of hiding would be dull and suffocating, but now he is glad to have found something worth dedicating himself to. And so, in the year 853, the Callista Academy was established to support the founding of the Callista Bank, divided into 2 branches, accounting and security, with its students drawn entirely from the region's commoners. Then, in what feels like the blink of an eye, 3 years pass. 3 years later, Hans's mother has grown far healthier, all thanks to the artifact, and for the first time in a long while she steps outside her room. Regina worries over her immediately, but Owen gently assures her daughter that she is fine, explaining that she simply missed the scent of nature and wanted to come out and breathe it in again. Filled with happiness, Owen asks Regina to walk with her. Over those 3 years, not only had Owen regained her strength, but many other changes had taken place across the region as well. Elsewhere, tax collectors arrive at a woman's home demanding an outrageous sum in taxes, leaving her helpless and confused, knowing she has no way to pay such an amount. Their exchange continues until her son steps outside, and surprisingly that son is Claude, now dressed formally rather than like a servant, after spending the last 3 years studying accounting and taxes. Claude boldly corrects the corrupt officials by reminding them of the revised tax rates, and though they try to argue, they quickly realize he knows exactly what he is talking about. All low-income citizens are entitled to a special reduced tax rate, and because his mother falls under that category, Claude uses the law to force the officials to back down. With no way to continue, they retreat, and Claude warns them that if he hears another report like this, he will file a formal complaint against them. The two run off like frightened chickens, hurriedly acknowledging his warning as they flee. After they are gone, Claude expresses his frustration over the fact that there are still rotten officials left in the region, while his mother worries for him and fears they may retaliate, but Claude reassures her that Hans will handle any trouble that comes their way. Meanwhile, back at the castle, a new maid knocks on Hans's door and receives no answer, continuing until an older maid approaches and points out the X mark hanging on the door. She explains that once the X sign is up, no one is allowed to disturb Hans, and the younger maid is surprised, asking whether Hans is doing something important inside, though the older maid admits she has no idea what goes on in the room whenever the sign is there. She adds that not even Lakia is allowed inside once the mark is up. What they do not know is that whenever Hans puts up that sign, he has already vanished to the lair to train. There he continues improving until he reaches a new level and is finally able to speak again with Sifford, whom he has not seen in 3 years. The dragon is impressed by Hans's growth, revealing that he has now reached the 6th circle, which is extraordinary considering even the Imperial Court Mage only made it to the 5th. Sifford also notes that Hans has successfully synchronized with the dragon heart inside him, meaning he is now capable of wielding large-scale magic, and the dragon pats him on the head in approval for growing so much in only 3 years. He then asks Hans whether he has begun training any disciples, which confuses him at first, until Sifford explains that great mages traditionally leave disciples behind, and because his legacy is meant to preserve magic in the world, he would like Hans to do the same. Though he makes it clear that Hans is under no obligation since the power has already been passed down, and he is free to decide what to do with it. Over the last 3 years, Hans has unlocked even more hidden sections of the lair, many of them filled with treasures. But although he could easily sell them and become rich, he has no interest in doing that, because he does not see wealth as Safford's true legacy. Instead, Hans tells Sifford about his plan to build a bank, which the dragon initially mistakes for some kind of loan shark business, until Hans explains the difference. Hans then assures him that once the bank is established successfully and enough funds are secured, he plans to found a magic academy to carry Safford's legacy forward. He remarks that the current magic academies exist mostly for appearance, with nothing truly meaningful happening there, because hardly anyone even tries to become a mage anymore, now that advancing past the first or second circle within a lifetime is considered nearly impossible. Magic is no longer truly taught because the world now treats it as something from a forgotten past. But with Sifford's power flowing through him, Hans intends to revive magic itself, and through that, raise dozens of disciples who can pass it on for generations to come. Pleased by the plan, Sifford tells him to pursue it. Hans then leaves the lair, soaring through the air with magic, looking down over his territory from above, and feeling satisfied with how much has gone right over the past 3 years. The preparations for opening the bank are also moving forward steadily, but then he remembers Lakia's advice about equipping the knights with plate armor and longswords, since if they are expected to fight, they will need proper protection as well. Hans agrees with him, though Callista had never placed much importance on weapons or armor before, because it was an underdeveloped region with little threat to face. Now, however, everything is different, and Hans knows they must prepare for war before it arrives. With that in mind, he decides to scan the mountains, hoping to find iron ore that will help with the next phase of their plan. While scanning the area, Hans suddenly notices a golden aura glowing in the distance, something unlike anything he has ever seen before, and it immediately captures his attention. He moves toward it to investigate and finds a wounded cat-like creature lying helpless on the ground, so he uses his magic to heal it, then picks it up, admires it for a moment, and decides to take it home. That choice turns out to be far more significant than he expected, because the cat-like creature later transforms into a person inside Hans's room. After bringing the cat back the previous night, Hans notices that it is growing weaker. So he decides to take it to the lair and place it inside the healing circle, something he never dared do during Lakia's time, because he wanted to keep the lair's existence a secret, though with this creature. He figures he can simply heal it and send it on its way. He sets the feline in the magic circle, and the creature's injuries are healed, but although Hans expects it to wake within 10 minutes, it remains unconscious for the next 3 hours. With no other option, he takes the feline back home, planning to release it once it wakes, knowing he needs to deal with it early in the morning because he and Lakia, who now serves as his guard knight, always have breakfast together. Hans places the kitten on the bed so it can rest comfortably. The next morning, Hans wakes up screaming, and the sound immediately catches Lakia's attention, causing him to rush to the room and demand that the door be opened. But Hans blocks the entrance with his body, still trying to process the sight before him, because the feline he brought home the night before has turned into a full-grown man by morning, and that shock is exactly why he screamed. Trying to get rid of Lakia, Hans blurts out that he only saw a bug, which made him panic, then says he will have breakfast with him later. He turns back to question the strange man, asking who he is. But before Hans fully understands what is happening, the man transforms back into a cat right in front of him. Hans had already suspected something unusual, but seeing the transformation with his own eyes confirms that the man is one of the feline folk. The feline folk are a mysterious race, living apart from human society, as ancient as elves and dwarves, yet rarely seen because they are extremely cautious about revealing themselves, and because of that, very little is known about them. The cat man casually starts wandering around the room, then suddenly announces that he intends to keep staying there, leaving Hans stunned since he does not remember ever giving permission for that. When Hans tries to object, the feline points out that Hans was the one who took him in, claiming he was practically kidnapped, then treated without consent, and for that reason Hans is now responsible for him. Hans quickly realizes that this feline is both pushy and sly, so he points out that he would have died if his wounds had been left untreated. Since feline folk are known to possess strength and physical abilities beyond ordinary humans, Hans reasons that there is no way a human inflicted those injuries, and he asks whether the feline was wounded by another of his own kind. That question hits the feline hard, and his sudden silence suggests Hans may have guessed correctly. While Hans is still trying to get closer to him, Lakia suddenly bursts through the door, startling them both, And the moment he sees the feline, he wastes no time drawing his sword and ordering him away from Hans. Lakia quickly moves in front of Hans, standing between him and the feline with his blade raised. And in that instant Hans remembers that Lakia is a swordmaster, meaning he must also sense the abnormal aura coming from the feline. The cat man is immediately enraged and raises his hand, ready to strike Lakia, and realizing they are both about to hurt each other, Hans uses Blink to jump directly between them. Both of them stop themselves at the last possible moment so they do not injure Hans. After defusing the clash, Hans turns to Lakia and tells him to calm down, explaining that the feline is dealing with some personal issues, which is why he decided to take him in, and he begs Lakia not to be hostile. An act of selflessness that shocks the feline yet again. Still stern, Lakia demands to know why a feline folk is roaming the human world, but Hans answers that it is a personal matter. Lakia points angrily at Hans, reminding him that he is his guard knight, then scolds him for bringing a stranger into his bedroom without thinking, and for jumping in front of a drawn sword without fear for his own safety. Hans replies that he trusted neither of them would hurt him, which is why he acted the way he did, and those words surprise the feline once more. Lakia continues warning him about how dangerous feline folk are, but before he can keep going, the cat man cuts in and finally reveals his name, Assa. Hans is pleased to learn it, and immediately suggests that Assa and Lakia put their differences aside and shake hands. The two reluctantly follow his lead, and with that, Hans unexpectedly gains two companions in the Compton Mountains. Hans does not press Assa for the details of his past, trusting that one day he will speak on his own, because he has no desire to force someone who only just survived, though he still worries about whether Assa and Lakia can truly get along. And so the three continue living together, though Assa constantly stays on Lakia's nerves, suddenly demanding snacks whenever he feels like it. Lakia cannot stand the fact that the cat man seems to do nothing except eat and sleep without serving any purpose, yet Hans still finds ways to spoil him, which only makes Lakia more annoyed. Not long after, Hans tells the two that everything is finally ready for the Bank of Calista to open, and with visible excitement, he reveals that its very first branch will be established in the capital. When it comes to wealth in the kingdom, the richest man is neither the emperor nor any duke, but Baronet Dominic Sullivan. Dominic founded the empire's first banking business and has ruled the financial world ever since. And although many nobles tried to break into banking after him, every single one failed, unable to overcome his monopoly. Back at his home, Dominic receives a report from his assistant, and while smoking a thick cigar, he tells him to present everything in order of importance. He is first informed that Duke McCarthy has summoned him regarding imperial protocol, and recognizing the importance of a royal summons, Dominic immediately says he will go, instructing his assistant to arrange the meeting for the afternoon. Next, he hears that Count Chenoweth has requested another month to consider a proposed deal. Finally, his assistant reports that a new bank has opened in the capital, operated by House Calista, though for now it has only one branch. The moment Dominic hears the name Calista, he shows almost no interest, dismissing them as a rural family with no notable investments, and assuming the bank will collapse soon enough, though even as he tells his assistant to ignore it, he quietly decides to investigate whether the Calistas have some hidden backing he does not know about. Meanwhile, in the capital, the newly opened bank is drawing an unusual amount of attention, not because banks are normally exciting, but because Calista Bank's business model is completely different from anything people have seen before. Hans's bank charges only 1 copper coin to open a new account, and on top of that, it offers loans without requiring collateral. In ordinary banks, opening an account costs at least 1 gold coin, and loans are only granted when collateral of equal value is offered, which is why commoners have never had any real reason to use banks in the first place, because only nobles could meet those conditions. But Calista Bank changes all of that. New customers are given practical advice on how to manage their savings, with tellers asking about monthly income and using that information to build proper savings plans. When it comes to loans, the bank reviews a customer's income and credit standing first, then issues only the amount that person can realistically repay, making the system far safer and more accessible. Even elderly people who cannot read are not ignored, because the attendants help each customer according to their needs. In that way, Calista Bank opens the door for poor commoners with no financial backing to finally access the benefits of banking. The bank carefully considers each customer's purpose for opening an account and their future plans, using that information to provide meaningful financial guidance. A woman enters the bank, uncertain about opening an account, yet she is visibly shocked when the process is made simple and accessible for her. Just as she finishes, something unexpected happens. She is handed a raffle ticket, and she learns that everyone who opens an account within the first month will receive one. She is instructed to place the ticket into a designated box, and after a month, a draw will be held to select 3 winners. Her surprise only deepens when she hears about the rewards, with first place receiving 25 gold coins, second place 10, and third place 5. The entire lobby erupts in shock, and people immediately rush to open accounts just to secure a raffle ticket. Standing nearby, Allman praises Claude for his ingenuity, revealing that the raffle idea came from him, along with the concept of credit evaluation, which he developed together with other trainees. Soon after, they receive a report that the bank has already reached its goal of opening 100 accounts on the very first day, with 4 hours still remaining. Claude is stunned, and on top of that, they have already received 30 loan applications. Allman is certain that Hans will be pleased with the results and even wishes he could witness everything firsthand. The locally trained staff and guards from Callista are performing well, and Allman confidently declares that they have successfully built a bank that anyone can use, exactly as Hans envisioned. Not long after, the news reaches Hans back in Callista, and he is delighted to hear that Allman and Claude are managing things smoothly in the capital. While sharing drinks with his mother and sister, he tells them that the bank has already met its targets and is running successfully. Impressed, Hans decides to reward all the workers with generous bonuses. Regina is happy to hear the news, though she still finds it hard to believe that her brother has become someone capable of running a bank. Hans then asks her whether she would like to try running a business of her own, remembering that she once studied management, and encouraging her to think about where she could apply those skills, promising to support her in whatever she chooses. Regina hesitates, admitting that nothing comes to mind and that she does not see herself as talented like Hans, nor capable of building something in Callista. Hans suggests that they travel to the capital, sharing the idea with Lakia and Assa as well. Lakia is surprised but agrees, having served as Hans's guard knight for the past 3 years. Though with only 2 years remaining before his name is cleared, Hans cannot help but worry about bringing him into the capital, even as he hopes everything will go smoothly. Before Hans can even ask Assa for his opinion, Assa leaps onto him in excitement, clearly eager to go. Lakia scolds him immediately, warning that Hans's body is still fragile and could be injured, but Assa ignores both of them entirely, too excited to listen. As they prepare for the journey, Hans can only hope that nothing goes wrong. When the day of departure arrives, Regina is surprised to learn that Hans will be traveling separately, and he explains that he cannot leave Assa and Lakia alone together since they still struggle to get along. He assures her that he will follow closely behind, knowing the journey to the capital will take at least a month, and that leaving the two together for that long would only lead to trouble. This reminds Regina that Hans supposedly found both of them during his inspections, making her question how he keeps picking up such unusual companions, and even raising doubts about the story of the healing ring he claimed to have received from an old woman. A brief silence falls as Hans struggles to respond, then he quickly excuses himself, telling her to call for him if anything happens. Regina later complains to their mother that Hans seems to be hiding many things, but Owen gently tells her not to overthink it, advising her to wait until he is ready to speak on his own. And so, the family sets off for the capital. A month later, they finally arrive, and Assa is the most excited of all, bouncing around inside the carriage. Lakia urges him to stay still as the carriage shakes, but Assa cannot contain himself. Hans understands Lakia's discomfort, because while everything may feel new and exciting for him and Assa, for Lakia, this is a return to a place filled with painful memories of betrayal. Assa continues acting recklessly, even opening the carriage door mid-ride, which earns him a knock on the head from Lakia, sparking yet another argument between the two, leaving Hans wondering if they will ever get along. It only reinforces his belief that he cannot leave them alone together, as trouble is inevitable. Soon, they arrive at the Callista townhouse, where Allman welcomes them. The townhouse, a residence nobles maintain in major cities, is the first of its kind for House Callista, modest in appearance but sufficient for their needs. Meline has also returned from medical training and now serves as Owen's personal physician. After settling in, Hans realizes he will likely spend more time in the capital than in Callista, though he has already prepared contingencies for that. Without wasting time, he prepares to visit the bank immediately, surprising Allman, who suggests he rest after such a long journey, but Hans refuses, saying that while Regina and Owen can rest, the bank is his responsibility and he must see it himself. Assa insists on coming along the moment he hears Hans is leaving with Lakia, and despite Hans's attempts to stop him, Assa refuses to be left behind. When they arrive at the bank, Hans is shocked by the massive crowd gathered inside. Allman explains that the excitement is due to the ongoing lottery draw, and when the third-place winner is announced, the crowd erupts in excitement, especially when it becomes clear that the bank is truly honoring its promises. Even the guards struggle to control the overwhelming crowd, unused to such numbers. Allman apologizes for the chaos, but Hans simply tells him to ensure safety above all else, while quietly feeling impressed by how smoothly everything is progressing. With the crowd growing too large, Lakia suggests they leave and Hans agrees, satisfied with what he has seen. He then proposes that they go shopping. At a clothing store, Assa immediately notices how different everything is compared to Calista, and Hans encourages both Assa and Lakia to pick whatever they like, offering to pay as a way of celebrating their arrival in the capital. Assa quickly selects a patterned fabric, fascinated by its design, and when Hans asks if he plans to turn it into clothing, Assa explains that in his homeland, they simply wrap fabric around their bodies, demonstrating it himself, and the result looks surprisingly elegant. Hans, satisfied, turns to Lakia and asks if there is anything he wants, but Lakia declines, saying that knights have no need for such things. Hans suggests upgrading his sword instead, yet Lakia refuses again, and noticing something off about him, Hans asks if something is wrong. Lakia insists he is fine, though Hans can tell that returning to the capital is weighing heavily on him. As they walk through the streets, they pass a knight commander, whose attention is caught by their conversation. And upon hearing Lakia's voice, he turns back, sensing something familiar, though he cannot yet confirm his suspicion. Meanwhile, back at the bank, something unusual is unfolding, as the commoners present are shocked to see a noble entering the premises. Inside the manager's office, the branch manager, Podier, is speaking with the noble, who makes it clear that his request is beyond Podier's authority. Without wasting time, the noble demands a meeting with the owner of the bank and finally introduces himself. He introduces himself as the eldest son of Count Chenov, Durin von Cheniavis, and reveals that he has come to the bank seeking a loan of 7,000 gold. Hearing that number immediately shocks both Hans and Podier, as the amount is enormous, far beyond anything they expected to handle so soon. Podier cannot help but wonder how Hans intends to deal with such a massive request. Just minutes earlier, Hans had been on his way back to the townhouse when he was informed that an important client had arrived at the bank, forcing him to rush over, only to now be faced with a demand for 7,000 gold. Hans calmly asks Durin what he intends to use the money for, and Durin is taken aback by the question, but Hans explains that despite recognizing his noble status, the amount requested is far too large to approve without understanding its purpose. At that moment, it dawns on Durin that Calista Bank might actually be capable of granting such a loan, and realizing this, he decides to speak honestly. He explains that the Cheniavis family was once among the 10 wealthiest families in the empire, thanks to their control over the vast grain supply of the Chernik region. Chernik is a land blessed with incredible fertility, where even scattered seeds yield abundant harvests, supplying most of the empire's grain and sustaining the family's wealth for generations. But everything changed under the current count, whose gambling addiction quickly drained the family's liquid assets. In a desperate attempt to recover his losses, he continued to gamble, raising the stakes by using family treasures as collateral, until eventually he risked the entire estate. Now, the accumulated debt has reached a staggering total of 7,000 gold. At present, the only institution capable of offering such a loan is Sullivan Bank, but they demand Chernik itself as collateral, something the family cannot accept, as losing Chernik would mean losing everything. Hans listens carefully and realizes that if the estate is managed properly, Chernik could repay the debt within a few years. After hearing the full story, Hans asks Durin to wait while he discusses the matter with his staff, then steps outside with Podier. Inside the office, Durin quietly assumes there is no chance the loan will be approved. Outside, Podier explains that if Chernik is offered as collateral, it is essentially lost, because Sullivan Bank will ensure the family fails to repay, allowing them to seize the land. This is why the Cheniavis family has been stalling negotiations, hoping for a miracle, even as their situation becomes widely known throughout the capital. Still, Podier firmly believes that issuing a loan without collateral is far too risky. Hans begins thinking deeply, knowing he has the means to provide the loan thanks to the treasures in the lair, yet he refuses to act recklessly out of emotion or pride. He tries to recall any information about the Cheniavis family from his past life, though it is difficult, as Calista was too remote to receive detailed news from the capital. Even so, he continues searching his memory, hoping to find something useful until suddenly something clicks and his eyes widen in realization. Without explaining anything to Podier, Hans rushes back into the room to face Durin. With knowledge from his past life guiding him, Hans understands that approving the loan is the right decision. He declares that Calista Bank will provide the full amount, leaving both Durin and Podier completely stunned. Podier immediately tries to object, but Hans reassures him that everything will be fine, then asks him to step outside so he can personally handle the contract. Though still doubtful, Podier has no choice but to comply. Durin remains seated in disbelief, unable to process what is happening, as his family had been mocked and preyed upon ever since falling into debt, with many waiting for the chance to seize Chernik. And yet now, Calista Bank is offering him a lifeline without requiring collateral. Filled with gratitude, Duran thanks Hans, but Hans makes it clear that this is neither charity nor a gift, but a proper business agreement. Duran reminds him that his family no longer has assets to offer as collateral, but Hans simply places a document on the table and tells him that all he requires are 2 written promises. With that, Hans finalizes the loan, securing the future of the Cherniavis family. When Dominic Sullivan hears of this development, he is furious, unable to believe that an 18-year-old boy could run a bank capable of issuing such a massive loan. From everything he knows, Callista is an underdeveloped territory with no significant resources, which makes it impossible to understand how they could gather such wealth. He questions his assistant, asking if they have overlooked anything about the Callistas, but the answer remains the same: there is nothing of notable value tied to them. This only frustrates Dominic further, as he cannot comprehend how Callista managed to produce 7,000 gold. He orders a deeper investigation into the Callista family, unwilling to accept that his long-term plans are about to collapse. In truth, Dominic himself orchestrated the Count's gambling addiction, manipulating events so he could eventually seize Chernik for himself. Not long after, Hans begins receiving letters, despite not having spent much time in the capital. His sudden rise in popularity, driven by the massive loan granted to Duran, has made him the center of attention. Among these letters is an invitation to a banquet hosted by Count von Heisert, someone they have never interacted with before. Lakia remarks that this is only natural, as Hans has become the most talked-about figure in the capital. Although Callista Bank was initially seen as a bank for commoners, its ability to issue such a large loan has sparked widespread curiosity, turning the Callista family into the subject of endless rumors and speculation. To avoid raising suspicion, Hans tells Regina and Owen that their late father had managed the family finances exceptionally well, which allowed him to fund the business, though he remains careful not to reveal too much. Hans then asks Lakia and Assa if they would like to accompany him to the banquet, but both decline. Lakia's refusal is expected, yet Hans is surprised when Assa also shows no interest. Assa explains that he has no desire for social gatherings, revealing that his playful nature is reserved only for Hans, and that he has no interest in interacting with others. Deciding to stay behind, Assa leaves, even Lakia surprised that he can show such restraint. At the banquet, numerous nobles gather, some enjoying drinks while others discuss business opportunities. When Hans enters alongside Regina and Owen, they immediately draw everyone's attention, and without any introductions, most of the guests recognize them as the Callista family. The nobles are shocked by Hans's young age, having expected someone much older, and find it hard to believe that someone so young could establish such a powerful business. Their curiosity deepens as they recall the Cherniavis affair, wondering how a rural noble could accomplish something so significant. Soon, their attention shifts to the elegant dresses worn by Owen and Regina, whose unique designs spark admiration and curiosity among the noblewomen, who begin speculating about their origin. One of the women approaches Regina, initiating a conversation, and before long, Regina begins to immerse herself in the social environment she had always been denied. Hans quietly admits to himself that this was his intention all along, as he wanted to introduce Regina to society and give her the life she never had. In his previous life, Regina had carried the burden of the family while her brother remained useless, leaving her no time for friendships or personal enjoyment. But this time, Hans is determined to change that. The dresses, in fact, came from the dragon's lair, which explains their exceptional quality. As Hans stands deep in thought, 2 nobles suddenly approach from behind, startling him, though they quickly apologize and introduce themselves as Count Milligan and Viscount Roxon. They express admiration for Hans's work, particularly his innovative approach of allowing accounts to be opened with just 1 copper coin. Hans humbly thanks them for their praise, and when they ask about the 7,000 gold loan to the Cherniavis family, he confirms it, though he refuses to disclose the details of the contract. Roxon attempts to probe further, hoping to understand Hans's financial standing, but Hans assures him that there is no risk of the bank going bankrupt. The 2 nobles then begin discussing their own business struggles, mentioning the difficulty of securing funds during the ongoing recession. As expected, Hans offers them a solution, inviting them to visit his bank for loans. In the middle of their conversation, Hans's mother approaches him, worried, saying she cannot find Regina. Her concern is obvious, but Hans calmly reassures her that Regina will be fine. Owen explains that she had left Regina with a group of girls so they could talk, but at some point, Regina suddenly disappeared. She has already asked the others, yet no one knows where she went. Hans tells his mother not to worry, promising that he will find Regina himself, and asks her to rest while he searches. He assumes Regina simply got lost, as she is not used to banquets or social gatherings. Using magic, Hans scans the hall but finds no trace of her. He extends his search outside, yet still nothing appears. Only when his search reaches the garden does he finally sense Regina, realizing she is speaking with someone. Hans heads toward the garden, but just as he gets close, he hears Regina scream. Without hesitation, he casts haste and rushes forward, arriving just in time to see a man drawing his sword toward her. Hans is shocked, as weapons are forbidden at banquets, which is why Lakia had not accompanied him inside. Before the man can act, Hans teleports between them, startling Regina with his sudden appearance. Using a rejection spell, Hans instantly disarms the man. At that moment, a mage appears out of nowhere and, after a brief chant, erects a shield between Hans and the stranger. Even Hans is surprised by the sudden appearance of such a powerful mage, and he immediately wonders who he is dealing with. Realizing the danger, especially with his family involved, Hans decides not to hold back and launches a wind arrow at the mage. The attack pierces through the shield and flies past both the mage and the swordsman, striking the wall behind them. The mage is stunned that his barrier was broken so easily, and in concern he speaks out, asking if His Majesty is unharmed. Those words make everything clear to both Hans and Regina. 30 minutes earlier, Regina had been enjoying herself with the other girls inside the hall, chatting about how different life in Calista is compared to the capital. While talking, she happened to glance outside and noticed a beautiful flower blooming in the garden. Curious, she excused herself and went out to take a closer look, leaving the girls disappointed since they had not yet asked her about her elegant dress. In the garden, Regina admired the delicate pink flower, wondering what it was. Then, a voice from behind calmly informed her that the flower was a lilac. Startled, she turned around to see a young man standing there. He explained that he has a fondness for scents, which is why he spoke without thinking, then asked if she also liked flowers. Regina found herself momentarily speechless, caught off guard by his presence, but eventually admitted that while she did not know much about flowers, she enjoyed their fragrance. She even mentioned that she was considering planting them along the streets of her estate. The young man was surprised, noting that most nobles avoid lilacs due to their cost, but he took her idea further, suggesting they would look even more beautiful lining public streets rather than being hidden inside private gardens. Without realizing it, their thoughts began to align, and when they noticed this, Regina grew flustered and apologized, her cheeks flushed with excitement. She could not understand why she felt so comfortable speaking so freely with someone she had just met. Realizing she had not even asked his name, she tried to do so, but at the same time, the young man also began to speak, making the moment awkward for both of them. As Regina finally asked for his name, the young man suddenly noticed a snake emerging from the grass, slithering toward her. Regina saw it too and screamed in fear. Reacting instantly, the young man drew his sword to kill the snake, and at that exact moment Hans arrived, believing Regina was in danger. Teleporting between them, Hans unknowingly stepped on the snake himself, completely misunderstanding the situation. Now back in the present, Hans and Regina bow their heads in apology, realizing they had been mistaken. The young man does not take offense, understanding that it was simply a misunderstanding. It is then revealed that the young man is none other than the Emperor of Rosenbaum, Late's Crow Carter III, and the reason he carried a weapon is because only members of the royal family are permitted to do so at banquets. The mage who protected him is introduced as the Imperial Archmage, Rumbly Ivan, wielder of the continent's highest-level magic. Hearing the commotion, nearby soldiers begin rushing toward the scene, but the Emperor has no desire for attention or escalation. Understanding this, Hans acts quickly and casts a mirage wall, concealing the entire area from view. When the soldiers arrive, they see nothing unusual and move on, believing the disturbance came from elsewhere. Once they are gone, Hans explains that he created the barrier to prevent further complications for the Emperor. Though he speaks calmly, Regina is completely shaken behind him, as she had no idea her brother was capable of using magic. As if that were not enough, Ivan suddenly grabs Hans, astonished by what he has just witnessed. The Mirage Wall is a high-level spell, yet Hans cast it without any incantation, something even Ivan struggles to believe. He questions whether he misheard or misunderstood, but deep down, he knows what he saw was real. The Emperor gently taps Ivan, calming him, then thanks Hans for his assistance and asks for his name and that of his sister. Meanwhile, Ivan still cannot hide his excitement. Hans and Regina introduce themselves, and upon hearing their names, the Emperor recognizes them as the rising figures everyone has been talking about. Hans, on the other hand, is aware that the Emperor is a puppet controlled by powerful nobles like Townsend and McCarthy, which explains why he lacks strong allies and rarely appears in public. Soon after, the Emperor and Ivan take their leave, with the Emperor expressing his hope to speak with them again under calmer circumstances. Hans is surprised that despite his situation, the Emperor still chose to attend the banquet. Turning to Regina, he suggests they return inside, but she refuses to let the matter go, demanding an explanation for everything she just witnessed. Hans attempts to avoid the topic, but realizing she will not back down, he promises to explain later and urges her to return to the hall first. When they re-enter, they immediately sense that something has changed. Regina rushes to her mother, asking why everyone is suddenly looking at them with disdain. Owen admits she is also confused, but notes that everything shifted after a certain gentleman entered the room. That man turns out to be Dominic Sullivan. He has already begun turning the nobles against the Calista family, accusing them of lacking proper etiquette. According to him, it is customary for a family making their debut to greet all guests personally, and he uses this to mock Hans and his family as uncultured nobles from the countryside. His words cut deeply, especially for Regina, who is visibly affected and ready to respond, but Hans stops her. He understands exactly what Dominic is doing and recognizes it as a calculated move. The tradition Dominic mentions once existed, but it has long been abandoned, making it irrelevant in modern society. Even so, the damage is already done, as the crowd begins to see the Calistas as rude and unrefined, with Dominic leading the narrative. Dominic's deep knowledge of etiquette, combined with his dominance in the banking world, gives him influence over nearly every noble present, most of whom are indebted to him. Few would dare oppose him. Hans had anticipated Dominic would make a move because of the Cherniavus affair, but he did not expect such a disgraceful tactic. Now, caught in the moment, Hans finds himself unsure of how to respond. He can endure the humiliation himself, but when it comes to his mother and Regina, he knows he cannot simply let it pass. Hans starts blaming himself for failing to think things through before bringing Regina and his mother to the banquet. He clenches his fist in frustration, but just then, someone suddenly calls his name. It is Durin, approaching him with excitement written all over his face, and the moment the nobles see Durin greeting Hans so warmly, the mood in the room begins to shift. Durin tells Hans that he had been looking for him ever since hearing he would attend, then goes as far as introducing him to his own circle of friends. Hans is genuinely surprised by the warmth of Durin's reception, and that favorable attention quickly spreads through the rest of the room. The girls from earlier return to Regina and resume talking with her, eager to continue the conversation they had started before, and this time Regina welcomes them openly. Soon after, Durin leads Hans aside to a quieter place so they can speak properly. He apologizes in case he was too familiar earlier, but explains that he saw how difficult the situation had become and stepped in because of it. Durin reveals that Dominic has created scenes like that more than once. Hans is not upset at all. On the contrary, he is deeply grateful, because Durin truly saved him and his family from humiliation. Hans then admits his surprise at the kind of influence Durin holds over the other nobles. Durin explains that much of that presence comes from his father's old reputation, because in the past, his father conducted himself so well that he was welcomed in every social circle. Things only changed after he became known as a gambling addict. Durin also tells Hans that he is grateful for saving his family, because without that help, he would never have been standing at the banquet in the first place. Hearing that makes Hans realize that he did not save the Cherniavus family out of pity, especially since he had no idea Durin's father was once so respected. On the way back home, Hans reflects on everything that happened that day. He realizes how badly he misjudged the situation, and how his encounter with the Emperor could have turned disastrous because of his own recklessness. That is when Hans comes to a harsh conclusion: magic and money alone will not be enough to shape the future. What he truly needs is information. Once home, Hans partially reveals the truth to his mother and Regina. He confesses that he is a mage, and that his power even surpasses that of the Archmage, though he still cannot reveal more than that. It is not because he does not trust his family, but because he is not yet strong enough, and more importantly, he cannot let anyone learn about the dragon's lair, since that secret alone could trigger a conflict far beyond his control. Owen is stunned by the revelation. She always knew Hans was hiding something, but she never imagined he was a mage. Regina, however, is still unsatisfied, especially since she witnessed everything with her own eyes. Hans reminds her that his magic must remain a secret, and Regina agrees. She then asks whether Assa and Lakia know about it, and when Hans says yes, Regina becomes even more upset, unable to believe that he trusted his friends with that secret before his own family. Unknown to them, Assa and Lakia are standing outside the room, hearing everything. Owen gently tells Hans that he is free to keep things from them if he must, but urges him to be careful, because his safety matters more than anything. Hans assures her that he will never make her worry if he can help it, then thanks both her and Regina for believing in him. After speaking with his family, Hans makes his resolve clear to himself. His goal in this world is not to become the strongest, nor to seek revenge, but to change the world for the better. Thinking about his next move, Hans heads toward the barn, steps inside, closes the door behind him, and teleports to the lair to train as usual. Assa and Lakia see him enter the barn, but neither can understand what he is really doing there. Lakia does not want to pry, because he knows Hans is still not ready to share all of his secrets. Assa and Lakia soon end up arguing with each other again, While elsewhere, Regina keeps thinking back to the events of the day, blushing as she struggles to get Crow out of her mind. Elsewhere, two men, Jeepon and Anil, are seen inside an information guild. Jeepon is lazily playing with cards because there is nothing to do, while Anil yells at him to find something useful to occupy himself with. But Jeepon reminds her that they run an information guild, so people are supposed to come to them for information, not the other way around. The problem is that their guild has been abandoned by the nobles ever since a certain rumor spread some time ago. Jeepon believes it may be time to shut the guild down and give up for good. Just then, there is a knock at the door. Jeepon runs over and opens it to find Hans and Lakia standing there awkwardly. Since Hans claims he has lost his bird, Jeepon asks what color it is, and Hans simply replies that it is blue. With that answer, Jeepon leads Hans and Lakia inside the building. As they climb the stairs, Hans reflects that the one thing he lacks now is information. He had not treated that as important before, but after what happened at the banquet, he now understands that he needs the right intelligence if he wants to move forward. His memories from his past life are limited mostly to Calista and a few major events that eventually reached that remote territory, but beyond that, he knows almost nothing. That is exactly why he has come to the information guild Lakia recommended. Upstairs, they meet the guild master Annabelle. Hans is just about to introduce himself when she cuts him off, because she already knows exactly who he is. She begins listing details about him and everything he has done recently, leaving Hans visibly shocked, though considering she runs an information guild, it is only natural that she would know. Even so, she has no idea who Lakia really is. Then she spots the cat behind Hans. It turns out Assa came along as well, only in his cat form, after insisting on following them while promising to behave. Annabelle promptly picks him up and starts petting him, rubbing his fur while Assa silently endures it, having no choice but to tolerate it because of the promise he made. Hans knows a little about Annabelle already. She is the guild master, a highly capable leader who built the guild at a young age. He is also relieved that she has not focused her attention too closely on Lakia or Assa, which is why she still lacks any real information on them. Annabelle's guild was once one of the best, but they got involved with the wrong target and suffered badly for it. The guild nearly collapsed, and the rest of the nobility stopped using them out of fear of the man behind it all. That man is Lord Angus, who has been doing everything he can to isolate Annabelle's guild. Annabelle is impressed that Hans knows this much about her and the guild already, and she admits she may have underestimated him. Finally deciding to take things seriously, she ties back her hair and sits down at the table to speak with him properly. She asks what kind of information he wants. Hans admits that he knows almost nothing about the capital or the forces moving within it, because he has lived in Calista his entire life. For that reason, he offers Annabelle and her guild an exclusive contract. What he wants is simple in principle, but vast in scope: information on the major nobles and merchants in the capital, as well as reports on incidents and trends worth knowing. In exchange, he will pay for each piece of useful information and fully fund the operations of Annabelle's guild, the Lucen Guild. Annabelle takes the contract and reads through it carefully. With the guild already cornered and its reputation damaged, she has little choice but to accept. Under normal circumstances, information guilds avoid backing a rural or politically weak family, but because the Lucen Guild is struggling to survive, this offer is too important to refuse. Annabelle then decides to show Hans what she is capable of right away. She offers him information on the three most important families in the Empire. Hans is surprised because he only knows of two, the McCarthy family and the Townsend family. Annabelle agrees that those two are the most famous, which is exactly why they are able to control even the Emperor. But there is a third great family, the Crower family. They are a noble house with 400 years of history, yet no one knows much about what they truly do or where they operate. The current head of the family, Marcus C.H. von Crower, has remained in seclusion for more than a decade. Some believe he is in his 20s, others think he is in his 50s. The strangest part is that the other two great families have both tried to pull the Crowers to their side, yet Marquis Crower has firmly declared neutrality. Even Hans never heard of the Crowers in his previous life, and from the look on Lakia's face, he is just as unfamiliar with them. Hans concludes that the family likely remained hidden because they were not causing major incidents in the Empire, nor were they openly tied to the power struggle in the capital. Pleased with what he has learned, Hans asks Annabelle to investigate the Crower family further. He then pays her for the information she already provided, which instantly puts a huge smile on her face. She becomes so excited over the money that she starts shouting about how she and Jeepon can finally afford meat again. She is so caught up in her excitement that Jeepon has to drag her back to reality and tell her to calm down. After Hans and Lakia leave the guild, Lakia asks why Hans is suddenly so interested in the Crower family. Hans explains that if even the two dukes are keeping an eye on them, then he wants to understand them for himself as well. Lakia agrees with the logic, though he cannot help worrying about the risks attached to digging into a family like that. When the trio returns home, Almond greets them with a worried expression. He tells Hans that there is a visitor waiting for him, someone none of them ever expected to see. Hans enters the house, only to find the Archmage Ivan waiting for him. The sight makes Hans break into a sweat, immediately thinking that he must be in serious trouble. He remembers using verbal magic in front of the Archmage, and the thought that his identity might be exposed immediately makes him uneasy. But just then, Ivan shocks him with an unexpected request, asking Hans to take him in as a disciple, leaving Hans completely speechless. It slowly sinks in that Ivan is genuinely asking to become his student. To make things even more surprising, Ivan tells Hans to drop all formalities and address him casually. Hans is taken aback, insisting that such familiarity is impossible when they barely know each other. However, Ivan firmly declares that he is already the student, and his teacher is free to address him however he wishes. Hans can hardly believe it, quickly pointing out that Ivan is older than him, and not just that, he is an archmage, making it unreasonable for Hans to take on the role of his teacher. He tries to appeal to proper conduct and social norms, but Ivan dismisses it entirely, explaining that such rules do not apply in the world of magic. In that world, everything is judged purely by skill, not age, status, or wealth, and for a mage, reaching the pinnacle is the ultimate goal. That is precisely why Ivan wants Hans as his teacher. Overwhelmed by Ivan's conviction, Hans struggles to respond and finally claims that his magic is not superior. Ivan refuses to believe that, reminding him of the sixth circle mirage spell he cast without any incantation. Hans quickly lies, saying it was only a third circle invisibility spell. Ivan is not convinced, pointing out that Hans clearly uttered the word mirage when he cast it. Hans continues to deny it, insisting Ivan must have misheard because there is no way he can use such advanced magic. Ivan presses further, asking if Hans believes even the Emperor misheard him as well. The moment the Emperor is mentioned, Lakia rushes into the room. Hans suddenly realizes he never told Lakia about meeting the Emperor. Ivan is irritated that a guard knight barged in without permission, but Hans immediately steps in, explaining that Lakia is not just a guard but a close friend, and asks Ivan to allow him to stay for the discussion. Though reluctant, Ivan agrees. After hearing everything, Hans expects Lakia to be furious, especially since he unknowingly attacked the Emperor, but instead, Lakia remains calm and is only interested in hearing how the Emperor is doing. Hans is also surprised that Ivan does not recognize Lakia at all. The illusion Hans cast on Lakia is a fourth circle spell, and since Ivan has reached the fifth circle, Hans expected him to detect it, yet he shows no reaction, even with Lakia standing right in front of him. Deep down, Ivan feels a faint sense of familiarity, as if he has seen Lakia somewhere before. Hans chooses not to dwell on it, as everything about interacting with another high-level mage is still new to him. Lakia then directly asks Ivan if he truly wants to become Hans's student, and Ivan answers without hesitation that he does. At that point, Lakia steps in and tells Hans that it is actually a good opportunity. He explains that helping Ivan is essentially the same as helping the Emperor, and that one day the Emperor will recognize Hans's talent, which could bring great benefits to them. Hans immediately realizes Lakia is thinking of using this connection to reach the Emperor, leaving him with little choice but to give in. He agrees to help Ivan, but clarifies that it will only be in an advisory role, not a formal master-disciple relationship, and also asks Ivan to keep his existence hidden from others. Ivan accepts these conditions and asks if there are any more, to which Hans adds that he does not want to be addressed with honorifics. Ivan agrees once again. Even so, Hans cannot shake the feeling that hiding his true identity from someone like Ivan will not be easy, considering Ivan's level as a mage. At the same time, Hans begins to understand why Lakia encouraged him to accept, as it opens the door to valuable connections. As Ivan prepares to leave, he runs into Regina. She greets him properly, and suddenly Ivan remembers that he actually came to deliver something from the Emperor, a letter addressed to Regina. Both Hans and Regina are stunned. Ivan admits he had been so distracted that he completely forgot about the letter. Regina hesitates, unsure what to do, and asks Hans if he should read it first, but Hans refuses, reminding her that it was written specifically for her and encouraging her to read and reply on her own. Regina takes the letter and retreats to her room. Later, when Ivan returns to the Emperor, he informs him about his decision to study under Hans, and only after that does he remember to hand over Regina's reply. The Emperor recalls how Ivan insisted on personally delivering the letter instead of sending a servant, and it becomes clear that Ivan had his own motives for wanting to meet Hans. In the Emperor's letter, he explained that he had to leave the banquet early and could not properly say goodbye. He admits that he attended the banquet because he had been hearing about the Callistas and wanted to see them for himself, curious about the person who opened a bank for commoners. He also confesses that while his attention was drawn to Hans, he did not expect Hans to have such a wise and admirable sister. He expresses that he enjoyed their conversation and wishes to become friends, suggesting they exchange letters. Reading this leaves Regina completely flustered, and she rushes to Ivan, asking for time to write a reply which Ivan allows. In her response, Regina apologizes for her brother's actions and admits that she too enjoyed their conversation. She agrees to exchange letters with him, as he suggested. The Emperor is equally surprised and pleased when he reads her reply. Regina accepts this arrangement knowing that the Emperor will one day be married off to a noble princess for political reasons, while the Emperor himself, though bound to live as a puppet, still cherishes the chance to connect with her through letters. And so, the two begin exchanging letters regularly. Hans soon notices this, and despite not being particularly interested in romance, can clearly tell something is developing between them. He wonders whether he should interfere, but when he searches his past life memories, he finds nothing useful beyond the fact that the Emperor eventually married a foreign princess chosen by the two dominant noble houses. In the end, Hans decides to leave things as they are and allows the relationship to unfold naturally. Before long, Callista Bank becomes the center of attention throughout the capital. It gains immense popularity among commoners, who begin opening accounts in large numbers until it becomes the norm. Claude reports to Hans that the bank has made remarkable progress, and suggests ending the lottery event after the next month. He points out that in terms of numbers, they are already approaching Sullivan Bank, and people from surrounding towns and villages are traveling to the capital just to register after hearing about Callista Bank. Hans is surprised to learn that demand is now coming from outside the city as well. He begins considering opening new branches, but Claude hesitates and explains that it may not be the right move yet. Apologizing for speaking out of turn, Claude points out that most of their customers are commoners, meaning individual deposits are small, even if the number of customers is high. At present, the balance between deposits and loans is nearly equal, and opening new branches could strain their reserves. Hans smiles upon hearing this analysis, and when Claude asks why, he explains that he is impressed by how well Claude understands the situation. Hans then tells him that this might be the perfect time to implement the business idea they had previously discussed. Claude is surprised, reminding Hans that the idea was still theoretical and had been abandoned due to major flaws in execution. Hans reassures him, saying he will prepare the necessary measures to overcome those flaws. Not long after, Callista Bank introduces a new system, the use of checks. At the Huffman Trading Company, a trader hands his customer a piece of paper, instead of coins when it is time to receive payment of 30 gold. The merchant is immediately confused, staring at the paper in disbelief, but the trader calmly explains that it is a check issued by Callista Bank. He assures him that if he takes the paper to the bank, he will be given the full 30 gold. The merchant questions whether the paper itself is worth that much, and the trader clarifies that he already deposited the 30 gold in advance, choosing to store it at the bank rather than carry such heavy currency around. Still unconvinced, the merchant insists on receiving actual coins, but the trader explains that he no longer carries cash. Seeing the man's hesitation, the trader decides to personally take him to the bank so they can withdraw the money together. At the bank, the clerk carefully examines the check to verify its authenticity, and once confirmed, the merchant is handed his 30 gold, leaving him completely stunned. Since it is widely known that gold coins are heavy and difficult to transport, trading companies handling large sums usually spend heavily on security, often hiring mercenary escorts to protect their funds. Even then, there have been cases where shipments were attacked and stolen. With checks, however, large amounts of money can be carried safely and conveniently without such risks. This innovation was Claude's idea, and he was confident it would soon spread across the entire kingdom. Not long after, Sullivan learns from his assistant that Huffman Trading Company has begun working with Callista Bank. This immediately angers him, as he was the one who helped Huffman rise into one of the top trading companies. The assistant explains that customers are flocking to Callista Bank to redeem their checks, and while doing so, many end up conducting additional business there. Soon enough, even nobles who were previously skeptical begin using Callista Bank as well. Sullivan is furious that a bank originally meant for commoners is gaining influence because of something as simple as a piece of paper. He takes one of the checks and inspects it carefully, noting the serial number, signature, and amount. At first glance, there seems to be nothing extraordinary about it, though he does notice that it is made from high-quality fiber mixed with silk, making it resistant to water and tearing. Concluding that the concept is easy to replicate, Sullivan immediately orders his assistant to begin producing checks for their own bank, regardless of whether they are identical or not. He is confident that merchants will return to them, since they are already familiar with Sullivan Bank. The assistant hesitates, pointing out that such a move is unethical, but this only angers Sullivan further. He reminds him that he was the one who pioneered banking in the empire and sees nothing remarkable about writing numbers on paper and monetizing it. Not wanting to face his wrath, the assistant agrees to carry out the order. Sullivan also anticipates that Callista Bank will soon expand, so he instructs his assistant to plant a spy among their future employees, ensuring that every detail is reported back to him. Frustrated, Sullivan reflects on the pressure of running a bank, all while secretly pursuing his own interests involving a noble named Bowen. Meanwhile, Annabelle delivers the report Hans requested. As Hans reviews it, one name stands out to him, Bowen, and he immediately asks for more details. Annabelle is surprised by this, realizing that Hans carefully analyzed hundreds of pages of information on the spot and even categorized them by priority. She finds it hard to believe he is only 18. She explains that Viscount Bowen has a rather unusual hobby, collecting women's clothing not out of vanity or perversion, but purely out of appreciation. He travels across the empire to gather rare pieces, building an impressive collection over time. For the past 3 years, he has been trying to open a salon in the capital, but Sullivan Bank has repeatedly rejected his loan applications. Hans asks why, and Annabelle explains that salons are considered lowly work for a noble. Hearing this, Hans calls for Potier and hands him Bowen's report, instructing him where to file it, which further impresses Annabelle, as she realizes he has placed it under investment priority. At that moment, Hans comes to an important realization: just as commoners are restricted by their status, nobles too are trapped within the expectations of their class. Later, Hans checks in with Alman about the territory and is reassured that everything is progressing well. With Hans's guidance, immigration has increased and the year's harvest has reached record levels. Satisfied, Hans concludes that he can set aside concerns about Callista for now. Not long after, Sullivan Bank introduces its own version of checks. Many people begin shifting towards Sullivan's checks, as they are already familiar with the bank, and some find it inconvenient to travel all the way to Callista's branch in the capital. Potier soon reports a decline in Callista's share of the check market, but to his surprise, Hans remains unconcerned. He explains that it is natural for competitors to imitate successful ideas, and that Callista has already achieved its primary goal of expanding its customer base. More importantly, their checks use unique methods that set them apart. Around this time, Bowen arrives at the bank for a meeting with Hans. He makes quite an entrance, holding a bouquet as he greets Hans in the meeting room. At first, Hans is slightly taken aback, having assumed from the report that Bowen might be eccentric in a negative way. But upon meeting him, he realizes Bowen is simply someone who genuinely loves women's clothing. Bowen admits he was surprised to receive a proposal from Callista Bank, initially fearing it was a scam, especially since it was not a loan but an investment offer. Hans reassures him that it is legitimate, explaining that Bowen will operate the salon without needing to repay the funds, while the bank will take a share of the profits instead. Hearing this, Bowen is overwhelmed with emotion and begins to cry, thanking Hans sincerely, as he has always been misunderstood and dismissed as a pervert for his interests. Even his dream of opening a salon was mocked, and he never expected someone to believe in him. While speaking, Bowen notices Potier filling a vase with water and casually mentions that it is unnecessary, as the flowers are artificial. He explains that he dislikes watching real flowers wither, so he commissioned artisans to create ones that retain their beauty indefinitely. Hans is amazed upon realizing that the flowers in front of him are artificial, yet indistinguishable from real ones. Bowen adds that each flower is expensive to produce, costing 2 silver coins. Hearing this, Potier immediately warns Hans to reconsider the investment, arguing that no one would spend that much on a flower when it is not even a jewel. However, Hans disagrees, because he already knows what the future holds. He understands that high-quality artificial flowers will become a major trend among noblewomen, used as decorations for hats, accessories, and clothing. Despite their high cost, demand will far exceed supply, eventually surpassing even jewels in popularity. In fact, this very trend contributed to Callista's downfall in his previous life. Although that future is still years away, Hans is certain the investment will pay off. With that confidence, he finalizes his decision to invest in Bowen's business. Later that day, Hans presents Regina with one of the artificial flowers, leaving her completely amazed, especially by its fragrance, making her question whether it is truly artificial at all. Assa, on the other hand, complains to Lakia that he is bored, since Hans has been so busy lately that he barely spends time eating with them like before. Suddenly, the two feel an overwhelming surge of magical power coming from the shed. Assa remarks that this strange energy has been leaking out every evening, and the two decide to investigate. Just then, Hans steps out of the shed, only to find them already waiting for him. Assa immediately questions him, demanding to know what he has been doing there every night, convinced that Hans is hiding something. Lakia, more composed, asks if whatever Hans is doing is dangerous, but Hans hesitates, unable to answer properly. Sensing this, Lakia backs down, understanding that Hans is not ready to reveal everything yet. Assa, however, refuses to let it go, reminding Hans that he was the one who insisted they should always be honest with each other. Realizing the situation could spiral out of control, Hans decides to take the initiative. He tells them he was just about to call them and brings them inside the shed, revealing a massive golden magic circle. He explains that he has been working on it whenever he had free time, and that it is finally complete, adding that he should have placed a stronger barrier to prevent its power from leaking out. Lakia and Assa are stunned by the overwhelming energy radiating from the circle, and when they ask what it is, Hans reveals that it is a warp gate. Lakia struggles to believe it, knowing that warp gates are seventh circle magic, something that even in the past was extremely rare for humans to create. This revelation makes him question who Hans truly is. Hans then finally comes clean, revealing that he is the successor of the golden dragon Saffrid, leaving both of them in complete shock. He admits that they had likely suspected something already, but chose not to press him out of respect since he saved their lives. While he could have continued hiding the truth, Hans believes they deserve to know at least this much, as they trust him completely, though he still keeps his regression a secret. Lakia begins to understand why Hans had to hide his identity, and Hans explains that he also needed to tell them because he plans to travel frequently using the warp gate, and he does not want them worrying when he suddenly disappears. He then invites them to step into the circle together. In an instant, they are transported to Calista Castle, leaving Lakia and Assa completely stunned. Since this is Hans's first time using 7th circle magic, he struggles slightly to stabilize the coordinates. Lakia quickly realizes they are in the storage room that Hans had strictly forbidden anyone from entering, and it becomes clear that Hans has been preparing this for a long time. Hans admits that he was anxious about leaving the territory unattended for too long. When Lakia asks if the gate only connects the shed in the capital and the castle storage room, Hans confirms that warp gates function only between fixed locations. Relieved to be back after months away, Hans walks toward the window, only to freeze as he sees a disastrous scene unfolding outside. He immediately rushes out of the castle and finds the entire area flooded. The butler, William, is shocked to see him, knowing he should still be in the capital, but Hans brushes it aside and demands an explanation. William explains that the territory has been hit by severe flooding, as it has been raining for over a week, and the river finally overflowed at dawn. The officials have already begun evacuating citizens from the lowlands. Unaware of the warp gate, William assumes Hans returned by road and asks if he is all right, but Hans is already deep in thought. He recalls that while heavy rains occur every year around this time, the river had never overflowed before. Trying to piece it together, he realizes that such a disaster never happened in his past life. William adds that the Western Plains have suffered the most damage, and this helps Hans connect the dots. Although Calista controlled a notable territory, it was never truly wealthy, as the eastern side was dominated by barren mountains, while the western side consisted of marshlands, unsuitable for living or farming. To change that, Hans had spent the last 3 years reclaiming the land, digging waterways and mixing sand to improve soil fertility. This allowed crops to grow and attracted immigrants, which led to increased harvests and overall prosperity. Because of this success, Hans had believed the territory was finally stable. But now he realizes that the reclaimed marshlands, which once absorbed excess rainwater, are gone, and the river has overflowed directly into the newly developed land. Most of the flooded area consists of farmland, but the damage is still severe. Hans asks if all residents have been evacuated and learns that most escaped early in the morning, while knights continue searching for anyone left behind. At that moment, Hans blames himself, realizing that the marshes had served as natural flood control and their removal caused this disaster. Assa cannot understand how this could be his fault, and Lakia supports him, pointing out that the reclamation happened years ago, so it should not suddenly cause problems. But Hans disagrees, realizing that his confidence in changing the future may have led to unintended consequences. He begins to question whether his attempts to improve things are actually making them worse. Lost in his thoughts, he is suddenly snapped back to reality when Lakia shouts at him, reminding him that as the lord of the territory, he must focus on solving the crisis instead of blaming himself. That is enough to bring Hans back to his senses. He quickly asks William about the servants and learns they were ordered to move supplies from underground storage to higher ground. Hans immediately changes the plan, ordering everyone to prioritize evacuating citizens and ensuring their safety. He instructs Lakia to assist the knights with disaster relief, acknowledging that saving Calista must come first. Soon after, Hans learns that there have been no casualties so far and that evacuation efforts are progressing. He orders the evacuation of those living near the riverside embankment as well, warning that the softened ground could collapse. At that moment, a knight rushes in with urgent news, reporting that the bridge downstream has collapsed. They quickly head to the scene and find the bridge completely broken in the middle. Hans becomes concerned, knowing that around 20 households live beyond that bridge. He asks for details, but the knight explains that by the time they arrived, the bridge was already in its current state, making it difficult to assess the situation. Suddenly, they spot a woman on the other side, desperately calling for help. She explains that there is a critically ill patient in the village and begs them to save them, as they cannot cross the river. Hans asks if there is an alternate route upstream, but learns that it is also flooded and too dangerous to use. Thinking quickly, Hans picks up a stone and casts a flying spell to test something. As the stone drifts away, he confirms that the levitation magic is highly affected by wind, meaning he cannot rely on simple tricks under these conditions. He then calls Lakia aside, asking him to keep the knights quiet about what he is about to do. Though curious, Lakia agrees to support him. Hans walks toward the broken bridge as the people warn him to be careful, but he remains focused, knowing he cannot turn away as the successor of the golden dragon Saffrid. He begins casting a kinesis spell, causing the rubble to rise and shift into place, shocking everyone watching. But he does not stop there. He continues layering multiple spells, his body radiating a golden aura as he stacks the castings together and finally reinforces it with a sixth circle hardening spell. Once finished, the broken bridge stands restored. Lakia watches in disbelief, unable to comprehend what he has just witnessed. Hans calmly instructs Lakia and the knights to proceed with evacuation, assuring them the bridge is now safe. Lakia acknowledges the order, though Hans can already tell that everyone who witnessed his magic will soon start asking questions. Hans sees his own actions as reckless, but Lakia immediately takes charge, shouting at the knights to forget what they just witnessed and focus on saving lives first. He then orders them to gather again once the situation is under control, because he has something important to announce. With the bridge restored, rescuing the stranded residents becomes far easier. The villagers begin thanking Hans for coming to save them, and Hans is surprised to find that there are even more injured people than he expected. Still, he is grateful the rescue moved quickly, because any delay would have turned the situation into a disaster. One of the servants soon approaches Hans and asks how he managed to reach the village so quickly when word had already spread that the bridge had collapsed. The question catches Hans off guard, and for a moment he has no idea how to respond. Thankfully, the woman they rescued steps in and saves him, claiming that the bridge never fully collapsed and that all she saw was debris. Another villager backs up her story to make it more convincing. The servant still insists that he clearly saw the bridge fall, but the others turn on him at once, telling him he must have imagined it because the bridge is standing perfectly fine. An elderly woman then walks up to Hans and thanks him for coming to save them. Because the village was mostly made up of outsiders, they had believed they would simply be abandoned to die, but Hans proved them wrong. Hearing that fills Hans with quiet pride. Once the flood response is complete, Lakia gathers the knights who were present at the bridge, along with the woman who witnessed everything. He tells them there is something he must say before they all part ways. It is no secret to them now that the lord of the territory is a mage, and Lakia knows they must all have questions running through their minds. He then asks them to imagine what would happen if powerful nobles learned that a young count who inherited his title at 15 also possessed magic among the strongest on the continent. Hans may have overwhelming magical ability, but outside of that, he does not yet have the means to truly protect himself. Lakia explains that if other nobles discovered this, they would try to seize Hans and his power for themselves. That makes the knights finally understand his point. He makes it clear that Hans's identity and power must remain secret. The knights answer in unison, acknowledging the order with force. Lakia then apologizes to the woman for dragging her into all of this, but she tells him she does not mind. She admits she does not know much about magic, but what she saw from Hans was incredible, and since he risked exposing his secret to save them, keeping that secret is the least she can do. Lakia lets out a quiet breath of relief when he sees that everyone is willing to cooperate. Afterward, he heads to Hans's office, only to find him already back at work. Hans reveals that he is reviewing the data from the Western Reclamation Project. Lakia cannot believe Hans is still stuck on blaming himself for the flood. With the map spread out before him, Hans confirms that the entire western side of Calista lies lower than the eastern region, which is why rainwater flowing down from the Compton Mountains collects there and forms marshes during heavy rains. He now believes that pursuing the reclamation project without fully understanding the consequences was an ignorant decision. Hans starts discussing the possibility of building a dam upstream to prevent another disaster like this, and plans to contact civil engineering experts at dawn. Realizing how troubled Hans is, Lakia tells him that caring for the territory is important, but warns him not to treat every burden as his alone. He tells Hans that he needs to learn how to rely on the people around him. Hans thanks him for the advice but says he cannot depend on Lakia forever, since in 2 years Lakia will be gone. That is when it hits Lakia that Hans once told him his name would be cleared in 5 years, and that he has only remained in Calista because of that promise. Hans then admits that he feels guilty for how much responsibility he keeps placing on him, especially making him act as Knight Commander while he is still supposed to be hiding until his name is restored. As compensation, Hans brings out something for him, a beautiful sword. He explains that he has been bothered by Lakia carrying around an old blade, and had meant to give him this weapon after revealing the truth to him, though events moved faster than expected. Lakia appreciates the gesture, but reminds him that guard knights are supposed to carry ordinary weapons. That is when Hans reveals that the sword is made from dragon bone. Lakia is left speechless. Hans explains that the blade is forged from an alloy called olephant, created by combining dragon bone with mithril, and that it is one of the only materials capable of enduring a swordmaster's aura. Normally, only dragons can refine such a material, but Hans obtained it from the dragon's lair and decided Lakia was worthy of it. Lakia grabs Hans and asks if he is an idiot, saying there are gifts one can give and gifts one absolutely should not. Dragon armaments are priceless, but Hans calmly tells him he knows exactly how valuable it is. Lakia then asks whether Hans can rely on Assa as well. Hans reminds him that cat folk do not live among humans, and believes Assa is only staying in the territory for the time being before eventually returning to his own people. Hearing that makes Lakia finally understand what kind of person Hans really is. Hans already assumes that both of them will leave his side someday, and yet he still trusts them with his greatest secrets, even casually handing over rare treasures. At that moment, a servant enters the room and reports that someone has arrived at the castle and is currently confronting Assa. Hans and Lakia rush over and find Assa locked in a tense standoff with a strange-looking man. Assa clearly knows him, and his name is Ryuji. Assa yells at Hans and Lakia to stay back. Then, without warning, Ryuji drops to his knees before Assa and addresses him as his lord, leaving Hans and Lakia completely stunned. Soon after, they all enter the castle, and Hans apologizes to Ryuji for the rude treatment he received from the knights, now that they know he is Assa's guest. It turns out Ryuji is a warrior of the cat folk. He thanks Hans for sheltering Assa, but explains that Assa cannot remain among humans because he belongs with his own kind, and for that reason he has come to escort him home. Hans is not surprised to hear this because he had always known a day like this would eventually come. But the moment Ryuji finishes, Assa flatly refuses, declaring that he has no intention of returning. Ryuji tries to remind him what humans are capable of, but Assa stands firm, saying he cannot go back because the person he is running from may still be there. Hans understands Ryuji's concern, but tells him that Assa is his precious friend, and that he is willing to let him remain in the territory for as long as he wishes. Assa immediately jumps behind Hans to back him up, insisting that Hans is a good friend and should not be doubted. Ryuji argues that everyone back home is worried and waiting for Assa, but Assa refuses to believe it, saying those people never truly cared about him in the first place. Lakia, listening closely, begins to wonder what kind of position Assa must hold among his own people. Realizing Assa will not change his mind, Ryuji decides that he too will remain in the territory. Hans is surprised, but he has little choice except to accept it since Ryuji is Assa's companion. And just like that, Ryuji joins the group. By midday, the floodwaters have already started to recede, but Hans is still troubled over how he is going to explain everything. He is supposed to be in the capital, yet somehow appeared in the territory and rebuilt a bridge with magic. While he is still thinking about it, Lakia arrives and asks whether he plans to return to the capital. Hans says yes, but admits he still has not figured out how to explain the situation. The servant in the room quietly excuses herself, and at that moment Hans realizes Lakia has already taken care of the matter that was troubling him. With that settled, Hans and his group return to the capital through the warp gate. As expected, Ryuji is completely stunned, since it is his first time experiencing anything like it. But Hans's troubles are far from over, because the moment he arrives, he is met by his worried sister, who had been searching for him so frantically that she had already informed the guards he was missing. Hans had only intended to test the warp gate and come right back, but after discovering the flood in Calista, he could not ignore it. So he is forced to explain to his sister and mother that a flood struck their territory. He tells them he went there to confirm the situation, but reassures them that there were no casualties. Even after hearing everything, Regina does what she always does and presses him further, demanding to know how he managed to travel to Calista and return in less than a single day. However, Hans's mother steps in once again to rescue him, telling Regina to leave him alone because he will surely share his secret when he feels ready. Regina responds with a sarcastic remark, telling Hans to send her regards to the servants the next time he returns to the territory. Meanwhile, Assa turns his attention to Ryuji and asks if he is really alright wandering around like this, but Ryuji assures him that he is fine, especially after spending so long searching for him. Just then, Lakia appears and tells Assa that he wants to speak with him for a moment. Assa tells him to go ahead, but Lakia insists they talk in private, since the matter requires some discretion. Ryuji excuses himself, though instead of using the door, he leaps out the window like a cat, leaving Lakia staring in disbelief until Assa calls him back to the conversation and asks what he wants. Lakia then admits that he has tried his best not to pry into Assa's personal affairs, but he needs to know one thing, whether Assa is running because he committed some kind of crime. His concern is simple: if Assa's past is dangerous, then hands could be dragged into it, and Lakia has no intention of letting that happen. He asks plainly whether Assa's presence in the household could put hands in danger. Assa answers that he did not commit any crime but says he is dealing with something deeply personal. Lakia falls silent for a while, waiting to see if Assa will explain further. But when nothing comes, he remembers Hands saying that Assa would one day return to his own place. Realizing Assa has no intention of opening up, Lakia tells him he will not interfere in his problems again. Just as he is about to leave, Assa suddenly asks about the new sword. Lakia explains that Hands gave it to him, though he is thinking of returning it because it feels far beyond what he deserves. The moment he says that, Assa's entire focus locks onto the sword. He immediately says that if Lakia plans to return it, then he will ask for it instead. Lakia argues that he cannot do that, but Assa looks confused since Lakia obviously likes the weapon. Lakia then reveals that it is dragon armament, something the world still knows nothing about. Assa points out that if Lakia intends to return it anyway, then he has every right to ask for it instead, since in the end, the owner will simply be whoever Hands chooses. Lakia realizes that Assa actually has a point, and knowing how Hands thinks, he suspects Hands would hand it over to Assa the moment he returned it. Because of that, Lakia immediately changes his mind and declares that he is no longer returning the sword. That decision quickly turns into another argument between the two, loud enough for even the people outside to hear. Later on, Hands and Regina head to the Imperial Palace after receiving a special invitation from Emperor Carter. By this point, Lakia has told Hands that after the flood incident, he wants to focus on personal training with his new sword, while Assa has been busy speaking with Ryuji about many things. Hands sees this as a perfect chance to return to the dragon's lair and continue his own magic training. He is still thinking about that when Regina bursts into the room, breathless with excitement, holding the latest letter she received from His Imperial Majesty. Panting, she tells Hands that Carter has invited them to dinner the following day. And so, the two put on their finest clothes and make their way to the Imperial Palace. Carter greets them warmly, admitting that their last meeting was far too brief. Once they are seated, he tells them he has been looking forward to seeing them again. Hands is surprised to discover that the only guests at the dinner are himself and Regina, with only Ivan, Carter's closest confidant, also present. He finds it strange that the Emperor would arrange such a private gathering, especially since in his past life, Carter was known to struggle with social interaction. Hands also notices that Carter carries himself differently now than when they first met. Soon, the chefs begin serving an impressive meal, leaving Regina visibly overwhelmed. The Emperor, noticing her reaction, asks whether something is wrong with the food, but Regina quickly assures him that everything is fine. Hands tastes the soup and admits at once that it is delicious, rich and slightly salty in the best way. Carter reveals that it is made with clams and shrimp, a dish he personally enjoys, and he is pleased to see that they like it as well. Ivan adds that the dish is not served often, making it clear that the Emperor holds Hands and Regina in especially high regard. Carter then asks whether they usually enjoy seafood. Regina says she rarely gets the chance to try it, and Hands agrees, explaining that Callista is landlocked, which makes seafood hard to obtain. The Emperor remarks that it is not much better in the capital, since seafood spoils quickly during transport and becomes very expensive, and there are even times when it cannot be obtained at all. He admits that although such dishes are reserved for nobles, he wishes commoners could enjoy them too. Hearing that, Hands becomes even more certain that Carter is different from the rest of the Empire's nobility. As the dinner continues, more dishes are served, and both Hands and Regina thank the Emperor for letting them taste food so far beyond the ordinary. Hands begins to feel that the evening is nearing its end, but he still wonders whether this was truly meant as a simple dinner among friends. Then Carter turns to his right and asks whether there is someone he would like to talk with a little longer. Hands immediately says yes, only for Carter to correct him and reveal that he was not speaking to Hands at all, but to Regina. The moment Ivan understands what the Emperor intends, he takes the opportunity to seize Hands and drag him out of the room, declaring that there is much he wants to discuss. Ivan leads him to the research institute where magic is studied. Hands is amazed to find that even in an age when magic is nearly gone, the Imperial mages still hold great status and are allowed to devote themselves fully to research and practice. Ivan tells Hands to follow him to his laboratory, and Hands is shocked to discover that Ivan has a private lab of his own, Ivan casually explains that he is not special in that regard, since all mages affiliated with the imperial court are assigned personal laboratories. As the two walk, a man in glasses crashes into Hans. Hans tries to take it in stride, but the man only insults him for being in the way. Hans is left stunned, but Ivan tells him not to mind it, explaining that the mages here believe their research is the most important thing in the world. Then Ivan asks what Hans thinks of the institute. Here, there is no rank, no wealth, no political power to worry about, and no need to get tangled in the petty struggles of noble society. Ivan continues praising the place, saying it is where people who truly love magic gather and dedicate their lives to it. To him, it is the greatest place a mage could ever be. At that point, Hans finally understands what Ivan is doing. He asks if Ivan is trying to recruit him into the institute, and Ivan openly admits that he is. He even assures Hans that he would be able to keep his identity hidden there. Hans now sees clearly that Ivan brought him here on purpose, hoping to lure him into the institute. But in the end, Hans declines. He admits that the offer is undeniably tempting, especially because it would let him meet other mages and make things far more interesting. However, there is one major problem: the source of his magic is entirely different. Draconic magic and human magic do not work the same way. Draconic magic comes from the heart and activates with a single command, while human magic depends on formulas and incantations. Hans understands that because he began with draconic magic, he knows almost nothing about human magical practice, which would leave him practically useless in a place like this. Just then, Hans notices a magic circle drawn on a board, and Ivan explains that it is a fire burst spell he has been researching. It is meant to be an improved offensive magic, one that evolves the basic first circle fireball into a fifth circle attack spell, though the formula is still incomplete. Ivan admits that, because he has spent so much time focused on defensive magic for the Emperor's sake, offensive magic remains his weak point. After staring at the circle for a while, Hans asks whether he is allowed to try correcting it. Normally, creating new magic is a point of immense pride among mages, a once-in-a-lifetime achievement and proof that one has reached the peak of their field, which is why they never reveal unfinished formulas to other mages. Because of that, Hans is genuinely surprised that Ivan is willing to let him alter something he is still developing. After only a few minutes of examining the structure, Hans identifies the flaw and corrects it. Ivan is absolutely stunned, then grabs Hans in a hug and declares him a genius. He confesses that he spent months trying to solve the issue without making any progress, while Hans fixed it in mere minutes. Hans tries to downplay it, saying he only adjusted an existing formula. But Ivan insists that Hans is a genius because he clearly understands the ancient runic language used in magic design. Hans is startled by that phrase. Ivan explains that the formulas used to build spells are all encoded in ancient runes, and the fact that Hans could grasp the operating principles just by looking at them proves that he is nothing less than a runic genius. It finally dawns on Hans why he was able to understand human magic formulas even though it was his first time seeing them. Ancient runic language is essentially draconic magic expressed in a linguistic form, and human magic is built by reconstructing those principles into formulas. In simple terms, draconic magic is the foundation of human magic. Realizing this, Hans understands that he can study both systems, since they operate on the same core principles, and the thought leaves him momentarily stunned. However, he quickly regains composure and apologizes to Ivan for touching his unfinished formula. Ivan, on the other hand, shows no anger at all, because in his mind, Hans is already his master even if the offer was declined. He tells Hans that formalities do not matter, and that learning from him would be the greatest honor he could ever receive. Hans is impressed by Ivan's attitude, as he shows none of the pride typical of other mages, caring only about the pursuit of magic. Just then, Ivan's disciples enter the room and are shocked to see that the magic circle on the board has been completed. Ivan himself is not entirely pleased since he was not the one who finished it. He introduces Hans to his disciples, explaining that Hans is a guest of the Emperor and that he is simply showing him around the institute. It turns out that the man who bumped into Hans earlier is also one of the disciples, and he immediately questions why a stranger has been brought into their master's personal laboratory. Another disciple tries to calm him down, suggesting they focus on celebrating the completed magic circle instead. But that only irritates him further, and he insists that the outsider should be thrown out, angry that a non-mage has been allowed to see their precious work. His attitude begins to get on Ivan's nerves, yet Ivan cannot say too much, as he is trying to protect Hans's identity. He reminds them that Hans is his guest and deserves basic courtesy, especially as someone invited by the Emperor. However, he cannot reveal that Hans is actually a high-level mage. The rude disciple pushes back, reminding Ivan that he is the one who always tells them not to care about rank or etiquette. Sensing that the situation could escalate, Hans calmly suggests that they leave. After stepping out of the laboratory, Ivan apologizes for his disciples' behavior, admitting that he has spoiled them, which is why they act that way. Hans assures him that he is not offended, understanding that Ivan was simply trying to protect his identity. He even mentions that he admires how close Ivan is with his disciples. Ivan explains that while they are highly skilled, they lack proper manners, and jokes that they would have fainted if they had seen Hans's true abilities. From what he observed, Hans can tell that all three disciples are talented, and considering Ivan is an archmage, he would not have chosen them lightly. Hans is certain that they will one day become archmages of the Empire themselves. He briefly considers how useful their help could be for his future plans. The two then return to the waiting room, where they find Carter and Regina enjoying each other's company, smiling and talking comfortably. Hans is surprised, realizing that while he knew they had been exchanging letters, he had no idea they had grown this close. Ivan watches Hans and laughs, teasing him for being unexpectedly dense when it comes to romance. After spending more time together, Hans and Regina eventually leave and return home in their carriage. During the ride, Regina suddenly asks whether men prefer quiet and graceful women. The moment Hans hears this, he realizes he has been dragged into giving relationship advice, something he has no experience with, causing him to hesitate. He carefully asks whether she is worried that the Emperor might dislike her. Regina struggles to answer, and in that moment, Hans realizes that she has fallen in love. She admits that she does have feelings for the Emperor, but clarifies that she has no desire to become Empress. She simply enjoys meeting him and talking with him. Understanding the situation, Hans assures her that he will always support her, no matter what she chooses, and tells her to follow her heart without worrying about others. He remembers Ivan's earlier advice, that trying to control Regina would only cause her pain, and decides to respect her feelings. Soon after, trouble begins to arise at Sullivan Bank, as cases of check counterfeiting start appearing. The head of the Huffman Trading Company is shocked when he attempts to withdraw money using a check, only to be told that the amount has already been paid out. At first, he thinks the cashier is joking, since the check is worth 50 gold coins, but the situation quickly escalates into an argument that draws attention from everyone in the bank. Ironically, he had been one of the first to switch from Callista Bank to Sullivan Bank when they introduced checks. Dominic Sullivan soon learns about the growing issue, leaving him deeply troubled. His assistant reports that counterfeit checks are appearing across all branches, and they are so well made that even employees cannot distinguish them from genuine ones. As a result, it is impossible to estimate how many fakes are already circulating. Sullivan immediately orders all checks to be recalled within 2 weeks, stating that only the original issuer will be allowed to withdraw funds at the issuing branch. After that, all check withdrawals will be halted entirely. The assistant is shocked, pointing out that 2 weeks is far too short, as many customers will not be able to exchange their checks in time, and suggests it could take months. But Sullivan dismisses the concern, saying they only need to notify major clients, as he has no interest in accommodating commoners. At that moment, another assistant rushes in with urgent news. Customers are flooding the main branch to withdraw their money. At first, Sullivan sees it as convenient since he planned to recall the checks anyway, but he quickly realizes the deeper issue. People no longer trust his bank. Nobles and major trading companies begin withdrawing large amounts, and at this rate, it is turning into a full-scale bank run. Understanding the severity of the situation, Sullivan is left shaken and asks how Callista Bank is handling the same issue. His assistant explains that Callista is managing it smoothly, as they are able to detect counterfeit checks immediately. Hans demonstrates the device to Annabelle, explaining that from the moment checks were introduced, every counter was equipped with it, and staff were trained to only release funds after proper verification. Thanks to this system, they can identify even the most convincing forgeries. Annabelle realizes that Hans anticipated the possibility of counterfeiting from the very beginning. Hans confirms it, explaining that no matter how complex a design is, determined criminals will always find a way around it, which is why he prepared a countermeasure in advance. Annabelle adds that information about the counterfeit detection device has become the most valuable commodity in the information market. From official guilds to underground networks, everyone is trying to uncover how it works, with Sullivan Bank being the most desperate, offering huge sums for even the smallest clue. Yet no one has been able to figure it out. Hans understands why, since the device appears to be nothing more than a simple lamp. In reality, it is a magical tool powered by embedded magic stones. Each check contains magic inscribed with specific wavelengths, and the device is designed to react to those exact signatures, allowing even non-mages to verify authenticity. At first, Hans thought he might have been overly cautious when creating it, but now he is glad he did. He tells Annabelle that the technology behind the device is unique to the bank, so even if information about it were leaked, no one would be able to replicate it. Annabelle feels slightly hurt by the remark, even though it is said jokingly, and assures him that she would never sell information about him or his bank, no matter the price. To her, Hans is a benefactor, the one who saved her guild from collapse, and thanks to him, the guild is now flooded with new requests. Hans is also pleased to be working with the guild, especially since it was Annabelle's organization that warned him about spies being planted among new employees when he planned to open new branches. He cannot believe how far Sullivan is willing to go, doing anything to bring others down. Annabelle explains that Sullivan acts so freely because he is backed by House McCarthy, one of the two dominant powers in the Empire alongside House Townsend. Hans then asks if she has any information on Marquis Crower, but Annabelle admits that there is virtually nothing available, as if the information simply does not exist. Hans realizes that McCarthy will soon notice Callista's rapid growth and will likely interfere, which is why he considers forming an alliance with the Crower family, though for now, he decides to set aside what he cannot control. He then asks Annabelle if she knows any trading companies in Somerville, and she confirms that she does, since Jeprian is from there. Hans follows up by asking if any of them specialize in seafood distribution, and while Annabelle does not have an immediate answer, she is confident there should be some. Somerville is the Empire's largest coastal region, famous for its seafood cuisine. Hearing this, Hans reveals his plan to open a seafood restaurant in the capital. Annabelle is surprised and immediately points out the cost and transportation challenges, but Hans assures her he will find a way to overcome those issues. He then assigns her guild 2 tasks: to establish reliable food distribution and to research which recipes would suit the tastes of people in the capital. Annabelle is stunned, but she quickly recognizes the opportunity and smiles. Hans is surprised that she accepts so readily without even asking for details, and she explains that working with him has taught her one thing: questioning his decisions is pointless, because whatever he sets his mind to, he always sees it through. Hans accepts the compliment with a smile and tells her he will be waiting for the contract. Due to the troubles at Sullivan Bank, Callista Bank continues attracting more customers. When Hans shares his seafood restaurant idea with his team, they respond positively, with Lakia even offering to travel to Somerville to study recipes firsthand. Seeing everything fall into place, Hans decides it is time to return to his territory. He informs his mother and Regina of his plan, which surprises Regina, but Hans explains that the business is stable and that leaving the territory unattended for too long is not wise. His mother agrees, though she mentions she will have to say goodbye to the friends she has made. Regina, meanwhile, starts thinking about going shopping before they leave. That is when Hans reveals that he plans to leave both of them in the capital. His mother is surprised, but Hans explains that she has only recently begun socializing again after years of illness, and now that she is building connections, it would be better for her to stay. His mother blushes at this, and Regina adds that she has been receiving invitations to many social gatherings, with people looking forward to her presence. Hans then turns to Regina, pointing out that staying in the capital would also benefit her studies and make it easier to keep in touch with her pen pal. Their mother immediately picks up on this and asks if the pen pal is a man. She proudly notes that Regina is at the age where she should begin considering marriage prospects. Hans, of course, cannot reveal that the man in question is the Emperor. Regina then asks if Hans will be alright staying alone in the territory, but he reassures her that he will be perfectly fine at home. Their mother is not worried either, knowing that Lakia and Assa will be with him. Soon after, Hans and his companions prepare to return to Callista. Assa is visibly excited, saying he prefers the territory over the capital, and Hans knows Lakia will feel the same since he has been forced to stay hidden in the city to avoid recognition. Ryuji joins them as well, though he chooses to sit with the driver, as he dislikes cramped spaces. Inside the carriage, Assa and Lakia quickly start bickering again, with Assa complaining about the ride and asking why they cannot simply use the warp gate. Hans tells him to endure it, since this is an official trip and they cannot rely on magic for appearances. Eventually, they arrive at Callista's territory and Lakia wakes Hans, telling him something feels off. When Hans looks outside, he is surprised to see a massive crowd gathered. William appears and welcomes him back, advising him to get off the carriage, as it will be faster to proceed on foot. Hans asks why so many people are gathered at the entrance, and William explains that they are immigrants hoping to settle in the territory, currently waiting in long lines for identity verification. Hans is shocked, as he expected fewer people after the flood, but William reveals the opposite happened. News spread that Hans personally compensated flood victims, and word of Callista being a good place to live traveled far and wide, encouraging entire families to migrate there. Amazed by this, Hans steps down and walks into the territory. To his surprise, citizens are lined up to welcome him. He asks William if he arranged it, but William denies it, explaining that people had been waiting for his return and the news simply spread on its own. William also reassures him that he has already created a story explaining Hans's presence during the flood, so there is nothing to worry about. Hans accepts a flower from a child, takes in its scent, and realizes he is truly home again. At the castle, the staff are lined up to greet him, asking whether he would like food or rest. Instead, Hans asks to review the administrative logs. He immediately returns to work, which does not surprise anyone as they all know his nature. William presents the reports, starting with the Compton Mountain project. Mining preparations are nearly complete, and work can begin the following month, which pleases Hans. He had secretly prepared for mining the iron ore, knowing the ducal houses might try to interfere, even though the resource rightfully belongs to Callista. William also reports that he has found the blacksmith Hans requested, a man named Grunberg, though he expresses concern that the man does not seem particularly talented and appears confused about his assigned role. Hans is unconcerned, knowing that Grunberg's true potential will only emerge later. In his past life, Grunberg became a renowned blacksmith sought after by many before eventually leaving Callista. Understanding William's doubts, Hans still assigns Grunberg to oversee both the mine and the new smithy. Next, William presents the blueprint for the magic academy Hans plans to build, a massive project that even makes him question whether Hans truly intends to proceed. Hans confirms that it is a promise he made to his teacher and benefactor. After hours of reviewing reports, Hans finally finishes. Lakia questions why he would push himself so hard on the very first day back, but that is simply who Hans is. Hans is surprised to see that Assa and Lakia waited for him instead of resting, but they assure him they feel fine after the carriage ride. Assa immediately clings to him, once again declaring that Callista is far better than the capital. Hans then suggests that they go on a territory inspection the next day, since it has been a while, and Assa eagerly agrees. Before long, 2 years pass as House Callista continues expanding its influence and business. Meanwhile, in the capital, one district grows into the busiest area in the city, and before anyone realizes it, people begin calling it Callista Street. This street earned the name Callista Street because the headquarters of Callista Bank stands there, a clear sign of how much the area has grown since the bank was established 2 years ago. But the bank is not the only reason people flock to the street, because there is also a seafood restaurant called Sea Breeze, and it has become one of the biggest attractions in the district. Everyone who visits enjoys the food, and what makes it even more special is that commoners are allowed to dine there as well. Even though the prices are a little high, they are still manageable enough for commoners to visit on special occasions, which is something that would have been unthinkable in the past, when ordinary people in the capital could not even dream of eating seafood. The reason seafood is now readily available is all thanks to Sea Breeze. In the past, fish would spoil before making it from the coast to the capital, but according to the rumors spreading around, a mage has been assigned to cast preservation magic on the cargo wagons leaving the seaport, allowing the seafood to remain fresh no matter how many days the journey takes. As the noble customers discuss this, they question whether such a thing is even possible, since preservation magic requires at least third circle high-level magic. Because of that, they begin assuming the Imperial mages must be involved. And what makes the rumor even juicier is the fact that Imperial mages are not supposed to use magic outside their official duties, leading one of the nobles to conclude that the restaurant must have ties to the Imperial court. Even so, the identity of the true owner remains a mystery. One noble is especially annoyed that the restaurant welcomes both nobles and commoners, especially since the prices were intentionally lowered so that commoners could afford to eat there too. Even then, the restaurant still keeps some separation, with commoners dining on the first floor, nobles on the second, and an upper floor reserved strictly for the most important guests. Meanwhile, Jipan is practically begging Hans to admit that he is the real owner of the restaurant, because no one would ever believe a commoner like him owns a place like this. Hans only smiles and says that he merely provided the funding and the planning, while Jipan was the one who researched and developed recipes suited to the people of the capital, which is why he should be treated as the true owner. Jipan has no choice but to accept the role Hans keeps pushing onto him, though he does admit that he appreciates the gesture. Hans praises the food, and Jipan confesses that he put extra effort into the meal because it is a memorable day. Apparently, Hans is resuming full-scale activity in the capital, because until now he had been focused mostly on managing the territory, but he is finally ready to expand into several more businesses. Just then, Hans hears that his guest has arrived earlier than expected, but since he has already finished eating, he tells them to bring the guest in right away. The visitor turns out to be Bowen. Bowen enters with a bouquet of flowers, kneels dramatically, and thanks Hans for reserving the upper floor of the restaurant as their meeting place. Once seated, Bowen begins talking about how well business is going and reveals that he is planning to open another branch in Benny. Hans is surprised to hear that, because it would make it the 5th branch already. Bowen's business started with high-quality artificial flowers, and when that trend exploded across the empire, it expanded into accessories, fabrics, and women's clothing. Everything Bowen touches seems to turn into success, which is why people have started calling him Golden Hands. Hands also compliments him on the success of the men's salon, noting that even though there was resistance at first, it ended up doing very well too. Bowen replies that he owes it all to his eyes. Hands is confused by that, so Bowen explains by pointing out that Hands has different outfits suited for each season of the year. He starts describing how he would personally style Hands if given the chance. And by the end of it, he remarks that he would make the sleeves tighter and thicker to better hide the gold bracelet Hands always wears. Bowen correctly guesses that the bracelet is something secret and important because Hands never takes it off, and so he advises him to be more careful. Hands nervously thanks him for the warning, because Bowen is absolutely right, the bracelet is the dragon's bracelet. Bowen then invites Hands to visit his salon whenever he has time, promising that he can bring out the best in him. He boasts that he can improve anyone's appearance except for one man, Marcus Crower. That immediately shocks Hands, because the last time he spoke with Annabelle, she said there was still no useful information on Crower. Curious, Hands asks whether Bowen has actually seen or met him. Bowen excitedly explains that younger people may not know him well, but he once caught a glimpse of Crower at a banquet 10 years ago. At the time, Crower was dressed entirely in dark clothes, as though he were attending a funeral. Throughout the entire banquet, he stood there staring outside, never speaking once, never interacting with anyone, and giving no hint as to why he even came. Hands then asks Bowen what kind of impression Crower left on him. Bowen admits that it is hard to read someone like that, especially since he never had the chance to talk to him, but there was one thing he did notice when he looked into his eyes. One eye was purple and the other was black. The moment Hands hears that, he realizes Crower has heterochromia. Later, Hands asks Lakia and Assa whether either of them has ever seen Crower in person, but both say they have not. Hands then reveals that the only thing Annabelle has managed to uncover is the rumor that Crower does not even live in Crower Castle. At that point, Hands is already growing frustrated and starts wondering whether he should just give up on pursuing him. Just then, Lakia brings up the fact that Hands is preparing for territorial war, and Hands confirms it. The surrounding territories have started becoming suspicious because immigrants keep pouring into Callista, making it obvious that the region is building towards something. Hands also mentions that he plans to make proper use of the Night Order that Lakia will soon leave behind. Even though Hands has gotten used to always having Lakia by his side, he has been careful not to build too many long-term plans around him because the 5-year promise they made is almost over. In that way, the two are already slowly saying farewell to each other. Soon after, Grunberg is informed that he has been summoned to the castle. By now, the servants and staff at the castle are already aware that Hands is a mage, but none of them care to pry or spread rumors, because all of them are working together to protect both the territory and their young lord. Not long after, Grunberg arrives at the castle to meet Hands. Even though he already knows Hands is a mage, he is still deeply impressed by how casually Hands moves between the capital and Callista as if the two places were neighboring towns. Once Hands finishes reviewing William's report, he turns his attention to Grunberg. It turns out Grunberg has finished the sword he was forging and has brought it for Hands to inspect. Hands takes the blade and is immediately impressed by how light it feels. Grunberg explains that he managed to cut the weight in half while more than doubling its strength, and promises that by the following week they will be able to supply swords to the entire Night Order. William is amazed by Grunberg's skill and credits the discovery to Hands's uncanny judgment. After inspecting the sword, Hands shows Grunberg what he wants him to work on next: armor for the Night Order. William, as curious as ever, asks if Hands designed it himself, and Hands confirms that he based the design on the Imperial Night Order's armor. Grunberg then points to the hollow section in the center of the chest and asks whether it is meant to serve as the power source for the circuit. Hands is genuinely impressed, because Grunberg figured out the purpose of the hole just by looking at the design. Grunberg admits that he may not understand exactly how it works, but he is sure it will turn out to be something impressive. After receiving the design, he takes his leave, and Hands turns to William, saying that he trusts Grunberg completely. William agrees, saying that Grunberg is a very reliable man. Then William says there is still one more thing he needs to report, something he has already mentioned before. It is the drought. That year it has only rained once. Thanks to Hands's foresight, they were able to build a large reservoir, and that has allowed them to manage so far. Even so, William is worried, because if rain does not come by the proper rainy season, everything will dry up, and that possibility is beginning to alarm everyone. Hands tells William that while they cannot control the weather itself, he has already prepared enough countermeasures to ensure no one in Callista goes hungry. He tells William to pass that assurance on to the people, so they have no reason to panic. After the meeting ends, Hands thinks everything through once again. He suspects the drought is only beginning, especially since the grass outside has already dried up. Even so, he refuses to recklessly interfere just because he knows parts of the future. He has learned the hard way that making careless choices that affect countless lives can lead to consequences he cannot predict, so he forces himself to slow down and think carefully. Later, Lakia looks over the sword Grunberg made and praises it, though he still proudly claims that his own blade is superior. Then he turns to Assa and asks where his bodyguard has been lately. Neither he nor Hans knows it, but Ryuji is always shadowing Assa in secret, moving so quietly and skillfully that no one ever notices him. Hans joins Lakia in asking about Ryuji, and Assa casually explains that catfolk are wanderers by nature, so even if Ryuji disappears, he will always return sooner or later. Lakia then asks Hans whether he has any major plans coming up, and Hans says no, explaining that for now he is mainly occupied with managing the bank and the restaurant branches. He is relieved that in his past life, nothing especially important happened around this time, which means he can focus on work. Meanwhile, the Emperor and Regina meet at their usual place in town, both dressed in commoner clothes so they do not attract suspicion. They greet each other warmly, clearly happy to see one another. The Emperor reassures Regina that he is doing fine and explains that Ivan helps him slip out occasionally so he can meet her. Still, Regina notices that something is off about him and asks whether something is wrong. He admits that he has received yet another marriage proposal from House McCarthy, and that his mother has been urging him to meet them, since endlessly refusing would begin to look improper. Hearing that makes it truly sink in for Regina that the man she has been meeting is the Emperor of the Empire, and that there is no guarantee things can continue the way they have. Then the Emperor asks whether she is truly satisfied with the kind of relationship they have now. Regina is confused by the question, and he clarifies, asking whether she is really fine with the way they hide their status in commoner clothes, and with the way they conceal their relationship as if it were some kind of crime. Regina nervously answers that she does not mind, because she believes he has been trying to protect House Callista from being dragged into the Empire's power struggles. She then admits that she has thought deeply about their relationship, and came to the conclusion that she would be content as long as they could remain friends even after he marries. But the Emperor immediately cuts in and says that he is not satisfied with that. Regina is stunned and can only watch as he rises from his seat. He reveals that at the next Imperial Grand Council, he plans to announce his intention to choose his own marriage partner. Before Regina can even process it, he is already on one knee asking her to marry him. She turns red in shock, covering her mouth in complete disbelief. Later, Alman brings Hans the latest banking reports, and Hans is impressed enough to tell him that he seems better suited for business management than butler work. Alman modestly replies that it is all thanks to Hans's talent for organizing people well. He then asks whether his successor, William, is doing well, and Hans assures him that William is doing an excellent job, even saying he understands Callista's internal affairs better than Hans himself. Hans then asks about drought conditions in other regions, because it seems Callista is the only place managing the situation well. Alman confirms that the reports are grim. According to Claude, who is stationed in Beni, most farmers are already hoarding food instead of consuming it, and some have even given up on this year's harvest entirely because they are expecting a major famine. Alman then asks whether Callista Bank will face problems if famine truly arrives, and commoners become unable to repay their loans. Hans tells him not to revise bank policy yet and to continue operating under the current one, assuring him that he will say when the time comes to take further action. After that meeting, Annabelle rushes into the office and tells Hans that they should attend the ball hosted by House Viscount Roxon the following week. Hans does not take the invitation seriously at all, and Annabelle can see that on his face immediately. He reminds her that he has no desire to attend social events. Annabelle then tells him this one is different. She reveals that she obtained information saying Lady Swergen will be there. That name shocks Hans because he knows exactly who she means. Rebecca Von Wyn is the queen of high society, the kind of woman whose name always appears on the first page whenever people list the Empire's most famous celebrities. Even though she spends much of her time outside the Empire, she is still on track to become the Empire's most celebrated woman, partly because Duke Townsend is her maternal grandfather. On top of that, she is so beautiful that she earned the title Goddess of Beauty. Annabelle reminds Hans how much Townsend cherishes his granddaughter, and points out that if Rebecca leaves the imperial capital soon, he may not get another opportunity to meet her. She urges him to use this chance to build a connection. Hans thinks about it for a moment, then tells her he appreciates the thought but has to refuse. He understands that Rebecca is important, but from everything he knows, she is the type who focuses more on business than casual socializing. Annabelle then reminds him that he is already of marriageable age, and that even his mother has started worrying about that. Hans is already 20 years old, yet he calmly says he has no need for marriage as things stand. That certainty is shattered later that same day when he meets the Emperor. The emperor tells him that he wants to marry Regina. The news hits Hans so hard that his footing gives way, forcing the emperor to lean toward him and ask if he is all right. An hour earlier, Ivan had suggested Hans come to the palace, and Hans assumed it would be something related to the research institute, never imagining it would be this important. The emperor then suggests they take a walk together. As they walk, he tells Hans that he proposed to Regina that very day, and Hans asks what her answer was. The emperor explains that Regina initially refused because she believed she was not qualified to carry the burden of becoming empress, and feared she would only become a burden to both the empire and the imperial family. Even so, deep down, she wants to remain by his side if she can. Because of that, she said she would follow whatever Hans decided, because her brother always makes the right decisions. Hans has long known there was something between the two. And as the ruler of Calista, he knows that Regina's marriage is supposed to be his decision. But a marriage proposal from the imperial family is not something simple. He knows with certainty that if this happens, it will never remain just a high society scandal. Because he remembers what happened to Lakia, Hans fears that the entire nobility of the empire could become his enemy. That leaves him wondering whether he truly has the power right now to shoulder something this dangerous. As he thinks, Hans realizes they have arrived at the Empress's court, where lilacs are blooming everywhere. The Emperor tells him this is the most beautiful and peaceful place inside the imperial castle, and that he comes here whenever he feels lonely and wants to be alone with his thoughts. Because the place means so much to him, he says he wants to give this garden to Regina, because it is the most precious thing he owns. In fact, he wants to give Regina every precious thing he can, simply to make her the happiest woman in the world. Hans remembers that after that dinner at the palace 2 years ago, the emperor never invited him and Regina back again. At the same time, Calista Bank was rapidly growing, which meant the attention of the nobility was already fixed on them. Because of that, Hans believes the emperor must have been trying to shield Calista from the pressure and scrutiny of powerful nobles. He also realizes that the emperor and Regina meeting in secret was likely part of that same effort to keep them out of sight. But now, without warning, the emperor has brought Hans into the empress's personal garden. That makes Hans think the emperor may finally be ready to confront the nobles controlling him. After a moment, Hans asks if he may ask one extremely rude and presumptuous question. The emperor tells him he may ask whatever he wants. Hans then asks what kind of world he dreams of creating. More than anything, Hans wants to know what direction the empire should move toward. The emperor thinks quietly for a moment, admitting that the question is somewhat different from what he expected. Then he answers, saying that it may sound like a fantasy, but he dreams of a world where everyone has an opportunity. He wants a world where people can live as they choose, without being chained by status, class, gender, or even birthplace. At that moment, it finally hits Hans that he does not need to be afraid anymore, because in this life he has gained at least some power. And if the people he wishes to protect extend beyond his territory, even into the imperial palace itself, then so be it, because he now has the strength to defend what is his. With that conviction, Hans drops to one knee, offers his respect to the emperor, and asks him to take care of Regina. Not long after, the Imperial Grand Council is convened, and before all those gathered, the emperor openly announces that he has decided to marry Regina. The room freezes in shock. One of the nobles immediately argues that the emperor cannot be serious, because House Calista is a remote family with no central political influence, not to mention no standing that would justify such a marriage. Others insist the matter is far too sudden, but the emperor reminds them that they are the very people who have been pressuring him to marry. Then Duke John Townsend speaks, saying that while the emperor may have developed affection for Regina, a state marriage is not something to be decided lightly. Duke Alan McCarthy agrees, adding that matters like this could shake the traditions of the empire if handled carelessly. The emperor responds by reminding them that House Calista is still a distinguished noble family of the empire, then demands to know by what standard they are measuring the dignity they claim to protect. Townsend answers that they already presented him with a proper list, one that included foreign princesses and daughters from houses they believed would strengthen the empire without damaging imperial legitimacy. McCarthy supports him, saying the emperor must not choose a marriage based on personal feelings like a commoner would, and declares that they cannot approve the request. The emperor has spent his reign voiceless, seated on the throne like a puppet ever since ascending it as a child. But that moment ends here. He sharply asks where in the imperial law any of what they are insisting upon is actually written. He reminds them that even his own mother was not born from an influential house, and asks whether they mean to say the current empress stained the legitimacy of the empire. Then, with anger rising in his voice, he accuses them of coveting imperial authority while hiding behind traditions that have no true history. With a cold face and an even colder tone, he declares that he is the master of the empire, and that he alone will choose the empress. Then he adds one final condition. If they continue to oppose his decision, he will never take an empress for the rest of his life. That would mean the imperial line ends with him, and the throne would pass to his paternal cousin, Duke McCarthy. The council members panic and try to calm him down, but the emperor simply stands and walks out. Later that day, Townsend is seen discussing the events of the council with his son, Glenide. Glenide is completely confused, believing House McCarthy should be pleased, since the throne would fall to them if the emperor dies without an heir, yet even they opposed the idea. Townsend scolds him, saying he lacks foresight. He explains that the empire prides itself on its long and supreme history, and no matter how greedy House McCarthy may be, they would never openly gamble for the throne like that. If such a power struggle ever happened, it would only lead to war, and that kind of war would end in the total destruction of one side. Townsend then says that the emperor sounded completely different from before, as if he had finally broken his leash, and now they have no choice but to follow his will. He reveals that he intends to vote in favor of the marriage, if only to see how far the emperor's newly awakened resolve will carry him. At the same time, Townsend cannot help wondering whether it was Regina or Hans who changed the emperor so drastically. Later on, Hans and Regina tell their mother about the marriage arrangement. She is stunned and immediately scolds them for telling her so late. Hans apologizes, though she has no idea that everything escalated within a single day. Their mother then says that she is not the sort of person who interferes in her children's marriages. But at the same time, she warns Regina that the position of empress is not something one can simply take on just because two people care for each other. Hans admits that he shares that concern, but assures her that both Regina and the emperor are prepared to face the future together. He also promises that he will do everything in his power to protect the family. With that, he asks their mother to trust both him and Regina. She smiles at his words and remarks that he speaks like someone who has lived an incredibly long life. Then she tells Regina she has no reason to object, because their happiness is what matters most. Regina thanks her for the support, and only then does their mother reveal that she has known about the relationship for a long time, because she often saw Regina sneaking out in commoner clothes. She then asks Regina to tell her exactly how she met the emperor. At that point, Hans mentions that the emperor has actually asked to meet her. Not long after, the emperor meets Owen and the rest of the family on the top floor of the Sea Breeze restaurant. Their mother is surprised that the meeting is being held in a restaurant, but the emperor explains that he personally requested it. Hans urges everyone to enjoy the meal, assuring them that only the finest ingredients were used. The atmosphere turns out to be warm and pleasant, and Hans is relieved to see his mother visibly relax. Ivan is also pleased, because he never thought he would live to see the day when the emperor would marry someone he truly loved. He even tells Hans that he is grateful, because everything began to change after the emperor met him and his sister. Hans then uses the opportunity to ask Ivan for a difficult favor. Ivan is surprised to learn that Hans wants to recruit his disciples as professors for the academy. It turns out the emperor already knows about the academy being built in Callista. Hans explains that magical education has declined badly, and if they want to cultivate outstanding mages in the magic department, then experienced and capable imperial mages are essential. However, since he intends to move Ivan's disciples out of the capital, he needs both the emperor's and Ivan's permission first. Hans's mother, meanwhile, is less than pleased that he has started talking business in the middle of such a gathering. But Regina gently tells her it is fine, because she is also interested in seeing the academy grow. The emperor and Ivan both say they are willing to respond positively to Hans's request, though they warn him there is no guarantee the disciples themselves will agree. Ivan explains that the mages in the Imperial Research Institute are people who refused employment under nobles, even knowing they could become wealthy by serving noble houses. They chose to serve the emperor because of honor and principle. For people like that, asking them to teach at a private academy might even feel insulting. Hans tells Ivan that he understands that concern, then reveals that he plans to personally teach the professors who will later serve in the academy, being a sixth circle mage himself. The emperor is stunned, because this is the first time Hans has openly acknowledged being a mage in front of him. Not only that, he also reveals his circle. Even Regina is shocked to learn that her brother is a sixth circle mage, while in truth, Hans is even beyond that. Ivan, on the other hand, reacts dramatically, grabbing Hans by the shirt and asking if he too can apply to teach at the academy. Later, the Imperial Grand Council formally approves the state marriage between Regina and the emperor. Fortunately, Ivan's 3 disciples are also appointed as professors for the academy's magic department. Still, the 3 of them are far from pleased with the appointment, because they know nothing about Hans yet. Ivan assures him that once they learn who he really is, they will come around and probably thank him for the rest of their lives. Even so, Hans cannot shake the feeling that things are going a little too smoothly, and that thought fills him with quiet fear. And as it turns out, that fear is soon repaid in the most violent way. Some time later, Hans, Assa, and Lakia are walking through the street when a supposed pickpocket makes the mistake of targeting Lakia. Lakia takes him down instantly. Assa is baffled that anyone could be stupid enough to try robbing a guard knight in broad daylight. While pinned down, the man begins ranting that nobles live comfortably while commoners starve. Hans immediately tells Lakia to release him, which surprises Lakia at first. But Hans quickly clarifies that he does not mean to let him go free, only that he should stop beating him and hand him over to the authorities instead. Hans already understands what is happening. The famine is worsening, and the harvest was tied directly to the farmers' livelihoods, which means everything is starting to go downhill. Just then, they return home and find carriages lined up in front of the house, leaving Hans stunned as he wonders why so many people have gathered there. Allman quickly rushes over and explains that visitors have been pouring in, all requesting an audience with either Hans or Regina. He adds that many of them are high-ranking nobles, which is why he could not simply turn them away. Hans immediately tells Allman to refuse all audience requests for the time being. In the past, the nobles who came looking for Hans were usually those desperate for emergency funding or trapped in financial trouble. But now that Regina has been announced as the future empress, the people coming will be those hoping to build ties for the future. Hans had already expected the famine, and he had also expected a surge of interest from other nobles after Regina was chosen as the future empress. But when those two forces collided, the result was something far worse than he imagined. Before long, rumors begin spreading that the famine is happening because of the future empress. People whisper that heaven itself is angry because the emperor chose an unsuitable bride. Hans rushes into Regina's room and finds her crying while their mother tries to comfort her. He is shocked because Regina was supposed to go out that very day to look at reception dresses for the wedding. Their mother then reveals that something humiliating happened. A stranger had tried to throw filth at Regina while shouting that she was tainting the imperial family with dirty blood. The guard knight managed to stop the attack and arrest the person in time, but the meaning behind it is more than enough to shake them all. Hans is left in dismay, but Regina forces herself to calm down and tells him that she is all right. She says she was only startled, and that from now on she will prepare herself to face things like this. Hans kneels in front of her and tells her not to get used to hearing such words, because she has done absolutely nothing wrong. Regina bursts into tears again, saying the people are not entirely wrong, because famine really has struck the land. She says that perhaps this is simply the kind of thing that cannot be helped. But Hans firmly tells her she is wrong, because this is something he can solve. Later, an announcement is made for the whole empire to hear. The people are informed that Regina has ordered relief grain to be distributed to all imperial citizens. Everyone is shocked to hear that wheat will be given out for free. In the year 858, a devastating famine strikes the land, and at the same time, relief efforts begin under Regina's name. When the lord overseeing the slums hears of this, he is furious that Regina has taken such action without his permission. His attendant points out that Regina is acting not as a count's daughter, but as the future empress. Normally, lords are expected to care for their territories and protect their citizens, but during famine, they usually provide only the smallest possible support, just enough to prevent mass death while using the crisis to make the people dependent on them. Because Regina is not following the usual method, the lord is enraged. He thinks she is naive and that since the famine is still in its early stage, the commoners will not fully appreciate her efforts. Then his attendant draws attention to something even more alarming. Regina's wheat relief program is causing wheat prices to collapse. As of that morning, a bundle of wheat is selling for 8 copper coins. The lord is stunned because just the day before, that same bundle cost 60 copper coins. The attendant explains that House Calista is directly supplying wheat to retailers under contracts that forbid them from selling above 8 copper coins. The lord nearly loses control when he hears this, raging that he has not even met Hans, yet the man is already interfering in his territory. Then the attendant adds that the program is being carried out across the empire, not just in their own region. At that point, the lord is left wondering how House Calista could possibly obtain such a massive amount of wheat. Thanks to Callista's direct supply, the rise in wheat prices across the empire is brought under control. And the roots of that strategy go back 2 years, to the very meeting when Durin von Cherniovis first came to the bank for a loan. That was when Durin learned the true conditions behind the 7,000 gold loan he wanted. For 5 years, 50% of the wheat harvested from his territory would be supplied exclusively to Callista, and the loan interest would be paid the same way. Hans had told him to review the contract carefully and point out anything he found unfair. When Durin took too long, Hans even asked whether 50% seemed too high, but Durin nervously said no. In fact, he was shocked that the conditions were lighter than expected, because with a loan that large, Hans could have easily demanded a full monopoly over all the grain. Durin then asked whether Hans intended to start a grain distribution business, since Callisto itself did not currently have food shortages. In ancient times, crisis always made the rich richer and the poor poorer. In Hans's previous life, countless people died because of noble greed. Wheat that normally sold for 5 copper coins rose as high as 100 copper coins, and even farmers were forced to borrow money they could never repay in their lifetimes. Because Hans knew that future, he sold Cherniavus wheat only in amounts small enough not to disrupt the market, while storing the rest. That is why Calista now has enough reserves to distribute wheat to all imperial citizens and still have plenty left over. Before long, relief distribution in the capital is complete, while requests from other regions continue to pour in. And before Hans realizes it, he is so overwhelmed with work that he has no time left for himself again. Lakia notices how exhausted he looks and asks why he is personally handling distribution, instead of simply selling wholesale to trading companies. Hans explains that major trading companies cannot be trusted with something like this, because if they secure large quantities and then raise prices, it would be nearly impossible to control the damage. Then Assa casually points out that Hans is handling this differently because the wheat is being distributed in Regina's name. Both Lakia and Hans are stunned to hear such an observation come from Assa, because he does not usually seem like someone who thinks that far ahead. Still, Assa is absolutely right. Hans never intended to turn the disaster into political capital. In fact, he always tried to stay away from direct conflict with the nobility, keeping his distance from social circles and avoiding both friendships and rivalries whenever possible. But now that Regina has become the future empress, neutrality is no longer an option. House Calista is now clearly the imperial family's in-law house. Hans explains to his subordinates that Calista can now lend its strength to the emperor, and for the emperor's sake, he is prepared to take a stronger stand. Lakia smiles when he hears that. Hans then asks whether Regina is alright since he left Lakia in charge of looking after her in the meantime. Lakia assures him there has been no trouble at all. Hans apologizes for putting such an important duty on him, but Lakia tells him things have changed. Whenever Regina goes into the city now, the only thing she receives is gratitude and cheers. That makes Hans genuinely happy, because it means the relief strategy is working exactly as intended. Just then, Alman informs Hans that Joel Trading Company has requested an audience. Hans is surprised because he explicitly rejected all audience requests, but the moment he hears that Ivan is escorting them, his interest is piqued. Annabelle had already warned him that Joel had connections to Ivan, and that he might eventually use them to approach Hans. Hans finally receives Ivan and Joel in his chambers, and Joel immediately apologizes for forcing the meeting so abruptly. Even though Lakia is visibly displeased, Hans tells him it is nothing to worry about. The man then formally introduces himself as Kirk Joel and apologizes for his earlier rudeness. Joel explains that he has come because he wants the distribution rights for the wheat currently controlled by Calista. Hans asks whether Joel understands why he has refused to deal directly with merchants until now, and Joel says that he does. He says he is fully aware of Hans's conviction to prioritize the public good and protect the weak. Joel then assures him that what his company seeks is not retail profit, but the chance to secure a nationwide distribution network through wheat supply. Because of that, Joel Trading Company is willing to sell at whatever price Hans sets without adding any markup. Joel continues, saying that Hans is probably wondering why he should trust him. To prove sincerity, Joel offers something major. His company will move its deposits to Calista Bank. That would mean Joel Trading Company, one of the top 10 major companies, would change its primary banking partner to Calista Bank. During the Sullivan Bank forgery crisis, Calista Bank did manage to capture more deposits and customers, but only 2 small trading companies had switched to using it as their main institution. Larger, older companies still preferred the long-established credibility of traditional banks over temporary momentum. That is why Hans immediately understands how valuable this would be. Because if Joel Trading Company becomes Calista Bank's primary customer, it would be an enormous breakthrough. The biggest complication in all of this is that Joel Trading Company still uses Sullivan Bank as its primary bank. If Joel were to change primary institutions as part of this deal, Sullivan would almost certainly see it as Calista stealing his customer right in front of him. And with Sullivan Bank backed by House McCarthy, one of the empire's greatest pillars, Hans is left wondering what he should do. He cannot help asking himself whether this is finally the moment he must openly clash with House McCarthy. After thinking it over for a moment, Hans tells Joel that he will accept the deal. Joel is pleased to hear that and assures him it is an excellent decision. Without delay, they move on to drafting the contract, and in truth, Hans makes this choice because he already knows he has offended many nobles through his relief policies. On top of that, Sullivan Bank almost certainly already holds a grudge against Calista because of the massive losses it suffered in the Czech business. Once the draft is completed, Joel is surprised to see that Hans set the supply price more generously than expected, reducing House Callista's profit margin. Hans explains that he understands trading companies exist to make profit, so it is only fair to leave Joel with enough room to benefit as well, if they are to maintain a smooth relationship. Joel immediately understands what Hans is doing, because it is a simple and effective way of building trust and discouraging betrayal. He is impressed by how perceptive Hans is, though he assures him that there is no need to worry, because above all else, Joel values his reputation. Joel then casually reveals that this same principle is what allowed him to secure trade relations with the cat people. That is when it finally clicks for Hans why Joel earned the nickname Negotiation Genius. He is the first man in the Empire, and still the only one, to have successfully conducted trade with the cat people. Hans also notices that Joel has been glancing toward Assa ever since entering the room, which means he recognized Assa right away. Hans is surprised that Joel could identify Assa even in cat form, especially since Assa was not leaking any magical power, and he asks how he managed it. Joel calmly answers that it was simple, because only cat people possess fur that beautiful, magnificent, and luxurious. Ivan is stunned to realize that the cat he has been seeing around all this time was actually a cat person, and he never noticed. Joel then walks up to Assa, bows politely, and greets him as the son of Shaha. The moment Assa hears that, he turns back into human form and demands to know how Joel knows him. Joel replies that Assa may not remember him, but he is the kind of man who never forgets a face once he has seen it. To Hans' surprise, Assa does not take that revelation well at all, and instead runs straight out of the room. Later, Hans goes to the room where Assa is hiding and asks if he may come in. Hans had long suspected Assa belonged to an important tribe among the cat people, but hearing Joel use the title Shaha makes one thing clear: Assa is the son of the cat people's king. Hans steps inside, sits beside him, and gently tries to comfort him. That is when Assa reveals that the one who wounded him back when Hans first found him was his own brother. His brother tried to kill him, which is why he ran away. Now Assa is terrified that if they ever find out where he is, they will come for him again. Hans is shocked by all of this and asks whether there was some kind of succession dispute between Assa and his brother, but Assa says no. He explains that the title of Shaha only belongs to the legitimate son, and since he is illegitimate, he had no right of succession to begin with. That only leaves Hans more confused as to why his brother would want him dead in the first place. Assa says he does not know either, and just from the way he says it, Hans can tell that Assa is still deeply traumatized by everything that happened. Hans then reassures him that he has already spoken to Joel and told him to keep Assa's identity secret. He also told Ivan, and Ivan swore he would never speak of it either. In fact, both of them swore that even if the whole world were collapsing, the secret would never leave their mouths. With that settled, Hans tells Assa that he is safe with him. At this point, Hans sees Assa as family, and he protects his family. He also reminds Assa that he already told him before he can stay for as long as he wants. On the morning of the imperial wedding, Hans is the first one to visit Regina's room and check on her. He asks how she is feeling, and she confesses that everything still feels unreal. Regina talks about how exhausting everything has been, from the planning to the jewelry selection, and Hans understands that while she is worn out, part of that feeling also comes from excitement. Hans then tells her to give him her hand, because he has a wedding gift for her. He reaches to his neck, removes his necklace, and places it in Regina's hands, leaving her completely stunned. Hours later, Regina and the Emperor are joined together within the palace. State weddings are usually grand affairs, but because of the ongoing famine, this one is held simply inside the imperial palace, largely out of concern for public sentiment. At the venue, Ivan has defensive magic placed all around the banquet hall, and even the weapon inspection at the entrance is extremely thorough, so Hans believes he can at least relax a little. Still, he prepared in advance, because the necklace he gave Regina is actually an artifact. That is why Regina was so shocked when he handed it to her. Hans had already told her never to take it off, and never to reveal its effect to anyone. When Regina asked whether the imperial palace was really such a dangerous place, Hans told her yes, and warned her that she could trust no one inside it. Now, standing in the banquet hall, Hans can only hope she never has to use that necklace. Once the official ceremony is over, they move on to the reception, and that marks the beginning of the real social war. For Hans, this gathering is essentially a battlefield for forming ties with powerful nobles as the Emperor's new brother-in-law. Before long, he comes face to face with Duke Townsend. Hans offers the proper greeting, and the two shake hands, but the moment it happens, Hans feels crushing pressure from the encounter, far greater than anything he felt even when meeting Sullivan. It is enough to make it obvious that Townsend does not harbor good intentions toward him. Hans cannot tell whether it was a silent warning or simple intimidation, but either way, the meaning is clear. Just then, he is informed that Prince Carol of Garcia wishes to greet him. As usual, Hans walks over and offers his greeting to the prince who traveled from far away. Carol is stunned when Hans greets him in Garcia's native tongue and immediately asks whether he speaks Garcia as well. Hans lies and says he only learned basic conversation, though in truth, that knowledge came from the dragon. Carol immediately grabs Hans's hands and excitedly praises him, saying he is the first person in the Empire to speak the language with such perfect fluency. He complains that no one in the room understands Garcia and that even his interpreter is nearly useless, leaving him completely frustrated. Before long, word spreads through the room that Hans can speak Garcia and that he has made it easy for Carol to speak freely for once. That alone makes people start wondering whether Hans is interested in trade since he knows the language of Garcia. Then Hans hears a gentle voice from behind him. When he turns around, he finds himself face to face with an astonishingly beautiful woman. She compliments his fluency in a foreign language and asks whether he travels often and what the farthest place is that he has ever visited. Hans answers that he has never left the Empire and that everything he knows came from books. Curious about who she is, he asks for her name. The woman apologizes for not introducing herself sooner, saying excitement got the better of her, then introduces herself as Rebecca Swergen. That is when it hits Hans that he is standing in front of the most famous woman in high society, the very woman Annabelle once urged him to meet. It does not take long for people to notice that Rebecca is speaking to Hans, and for many of them, this is the first time they have ever seen her approach a man first. Rebecca soon notices that they have become the center of attention and apologizes for making Hans uncomfortable, saying she should probably leave. But Hans tells her not to worry because he is fine. He reminds her that the party has only just begun, but Rebecca insists on leaving anyway. As she walks away, she tells Hans that if fate allows it, they will meet again. The moment the men nearby realize she is leaving, they rush to offer to escort her, and Hans can finally understand just how popular she truly is. Since he has already greeted most of the key figures, Hans starts thinking about taking a short rest. That is when Claude suddenly appears behind him. Hans asks if he is alright and Claude answers yes, but in truth, it is not really Claude at all. The man standing there is Lakia. Lakia wanted to attend the wedding so badly that Hans used illusion magic to make him look like Claude. Before coming, Hans had asked whether Lakia would really be alright facing so many of the nobles who ruined his family. Lakia admitted it was a real concern, but at the same time, he said it would have been a far greater regret to miss the Emperor's wedding with his own eyes. Later on, Regina spends the entire morning speaking with the Emperor's mother, Dajaeger. Dajaeger expresses regret that she could not attend the wedding, but Regina gently tells her that her recovery comes first. Regina explains that her own mother was sick through much of her childhood, and that she was the one who cared for her during those years, so she understands how difficult life can be for the one who is ill. She then tells Dajaeger that she would like to become a true companion to her. Dajaeger is deeply impressed by the way Regina carries herself and quietly concludes that she does not deserve such a good daughter-in-law. A little later, she catches sight of her son standing at the door and suggests that Regina go, since her husband is already waiting for her. But the Emperor steps inside and says he is not there to rush them, only to make sure the two of them are getting along well. Even so, Dajaeger insists that Regina go meet her husband. Regina and the Emperor then bow respectfully to her before leaving. Dajaeger is happy to see that her son is finally smiling again. As they walk through the palace halls, the Emperor thanks Regina for being so kind to his mother, saying she has visibly regained strength ever since Regina entered the imperial palace. Regina replies that it is nothing extraordinary because Dajaeger reminds her of her own mother as well. Just then, an attendant informs her that a letter has arrived from House Callista. Regina reads it and is shocked to learn that Hans's academy has finally been completed. When Hans first toured the academy, he was completely overwhelmed by just how vast the grounds were. Alman assures him that it will become the finest academy on the continent, just as he envisioned. Assa, meanwhile, is already exhausted from the tour simply because the place is so huge. In fact, he has forgotten nearly everything he saw, which prompts Hans to offer an explanation using the map instead. Hans explains that the academy has 3 departments: administrative studies, night training, and magic studies. The main building at the center is for all students, since that is where the required general courses will be held. He also points out the dormitories and dining areas. At that point, Lakia cuts in and asks whether Hans truly believes many people will accept the idea of shared dormitories. Hans understands why Lakia would struggle to grasp the idea that nobles and commoners would live in the same place. In fact, there is already heavy resistance from noble families, many of whom have decided they cannot send their children there. Even so, Hans already has a solution in mind. He explains that admission is based on 2 standards: enormous tuition fees and noble status. Then he reveals that the academy will be most appealing to those who can meet only one of those conditions, because he intends to admit students on merit as well. Hans points out that even Lakia has seen for himself that commoners can sometimes surpass nobles. He then turns to the magic department and explains that while there are 4 academies in the Empire, only 2 even claim to teach magic, and even those mostly keep magic faculties for appearances because they cannot offer real instruction. His academy will be different, because the professors will be imperial mages, specifically Ivan's disciples. Regardless of wealth or status, anyone truly serious about becoming a mage will have no choice but to come here. Meanwhile, Ivan's disciples are on their way to the academy, confused about why Ivan suddenly sent them to some unknown institution. One of them assumes Ivan had no choice, since House Callista is now tied to the Emperor through marriage, but another disagrees, reminding the others that Ivan would never mix personal matters with his public responsibilities. Elsewhere, when Townsend hears about Hans's academy, he immediately begins forming dark suspicions. He convinces himself that Hans used Regina to seduce the Emperor so he could gain access to him. He also assumes that Ivan is the one using magic to keep Seabreeze running, which in his mind proves that Callista owns the restaurant. From there, he concludes that the same thing must have happened with the bank, and that Hans relied on Ivan's help to create the counterfeit detector as well. His attendant tries to point out that the timeline does not match, but Townsend brushes that aside in frustration. He says what truly concerns him is the way Hans operates. By now, it has become clear to him that Hans is constantly trying to place commoners and nobles in the same spaces. Townsend begins to wonder whether Hans is trying to lower noble status itself, or whether he has some deeper political goal in mind. Unable to read Hans's intentions, Townsend reaches one conclusion: Hans must be eliminated. His attendant is horrified by those words and reminds him that the situation is far more complicated than before. Hans has already carried out major famine relief, and beyond that, he is now the Emperor's brother-in-law, which makes destroying his reputation much harder than before. But Townsend grows even colder and says the elimination he is speaking of is far more serious than mere scandal. Then he orders his attendant to make preparations, because the time has finally come to send Hans on his way. Not long after, news of the new academy shakes the capital and sparks rumors everywhere. Even so, the morning of the entrance ceremony finally arrives. Two students from the Magic Studies department, Jane and Anthony, are seen in the dining area. All meals are provided free at the main cafeteria, though students can also choose to visit the separate campus dining district, where snacks, desserts, and other special foods are sold. Even those prices are subsidized to reduce the burden on students. Hans named the institution's Safford Academy exactly as he had promised. Anthony cannot hide his joy at the fact that a commoner like him was allowed to become a student there. Jane then points out that the dormitories consist of private single rooms, which means every student gets their own space. Just then, a noble passes by and mocks the two of them, calling them noisy commoners. Even so, there are many nobles attending the academy because they all want to study under Ivan's disciples. Some of them even withdrew from other academies just to enroll here. Jane and Anthony are thrilled when they realize that they were truly admitted on merit. Suddenly, Rebecca walks up to them and asks what they think of the academy so far. Anthony is shocked that a noble has approached them at all, and not just any noble, but a beautiful one at that. Totally flustered, Jane eagerly tells Rebecca that she will answer whatever she wants to know, though she also admits that they are only freshmen and still know very little. Rebecca then says she wants to know what the name Safford means. Until now, Hans has always used the Callista name in everything he built, which makes the Academy's name an exception. Jane replies that she has never really thought about where the name came from, and Anthony adds that there is nothing about it in the entrance guidebook either. That makes Rebecca realize that even the students themselves have no idea. Still, she thanks them for answering. As she prepares to leave, Anthony asks what department she belongs to, but Rebecca replies that she is only touring the academy. Anthony is not too surprised, since the first day is open to everyone. In fact, there is even a reporter walking around the grounds. The moment he spots Rebecca, he lifts his camera to photograph her, because he already suspected that she would not miss an event like this, given her love of exploring unfamiliar places. Rebecca quickly notices that most of the nobles are still struggling to accept the idea of sharing a place with commoners, while the commoners themselves are overflowing with excitement. That only confirms her suspicion that Hans is a very interesting person. Then in the distance, she notices a man who immediately feels out of place. A moment later, she locks eyes with him, and the mismatched colors of his eyes instantly reveal who he is, Marcus Crower. But the moment he realizes she recognized him, he turns and begins to leave. Crower has already identified her as Townsend's granddaughter, which makes him decide he needs to be careful. As he walks away, he passes another person who also catches his attention, leaving him quietly wondering what exactly Hans has gathered at this academy. Before long, the students are called to assemble in the main hall. Some of the nobles cannot believe they are being made to stand in the same hall as commoners. Then, not long after, the chairman of the academy, Hans, steps forward to address everyone. He thanks all the students and parents for coming from near and far, and officially declares the ceremony open. In his speech, Hans explains that the Academy's core principle is equality. He speaks about wanting to give everyone the opportunity to study and about creating a positive cycle where that knowledge eventually flows back into society. The parents are stunned when they realize just how young Hans is. Many of them begin wondering how someone his age could know so much about education. Some even assume he was only able to build the academy through the fortune he made from the bank. Meanwhile, Ivan's disciples hear the parents whispering among themselves, and they quickly realize that the parents do not trust Hans at all. Tara, the only woman among Ivan's disciples, says she does not really care about anything else, because she is only there under Ivan's orders. She believes Hans is treating the academy like some money-making scheme, but her colleague Byron disagrees, pointing out that he already inspected the main building and everything was constructed with the finest materials. Byron cannot believe Hans would spend that much unless he truly cared about magic. Porto, the third disciple, remains unimpressed, convinced that Hans may have the money to build an academy but knows nothing about magic itself. While delivering his speech, Hans senses unfamiliar mana in the air, and since he cannot tell whether it is connected to Ivan's disciples, he decides to focus on finishing the entrance ceremony first. Off in the distance, Lakia and Assa stand together watching Hans speak. Assa comments that Hans handles the speech so smoothly, almost as if he has lived through all of this before, but Lakia tells him that Hans simply prepared himself thoroughly. Then Lakia teases Assa, pointing out that he has not wandered off at all today, which is very unlike him. Assa replies that today feels different from any other day, and that on top of that, something feels wrong. Suddenly, Assa's senses pick up something sinister and he leaps forward at once. Lakia grabs him to stop him, but before either of them can react, the roof starts coming down. Panic explodes through the hall, and one of the nobles immediately blames the collapse on cheap materials. His wife screams at him to stop talking nonsense and get their daughters to safety first. As the situation grows worse, Lakia shouts at Hans to get out of the building while they help evacuate everyone. Hans tells everyone to stay calm, but just as he is about to use magic, he realizes that something strange is holding him back. In an instant, he understands that he is being restrained by the same energy shaking the building. There is no doubt in his mind, someone has cast a hold spell, and that means a mage is behind all of this. As the chaos spreads, Porto wants to try using his own magic, but Tara grabs him and tells him they need to get out first. Hans nearly loses his mind when he realizes there is a mage inside the building trying to kill everyone. And as expected, the suspicious man he sensed earlier is the one behind it all. But just as the man is about to savor his success, Hans shatters the hold spell and restrains him instead. The hostile mage sees this and is immediately overcome with fear. By then it is already too late because Hans is furious and his eyes have turned yellow. The enemy mage is so terrified that he loses his footing and crashes to the ground. At that moment, the people still inside the hall look up and see Hans floating in the air. Even Assa is shocked that Hans is openly exposing himself as a mage. But Hans knows this situation is far more dangerous than the flood had ever been. If the building collapses, the disaster will be much worse, and he has to protect everyone from the falling debris. He quickly realizes he needs a spell that is overwhelmingly powerful, yet delicate enough to hold everything together without causing more damage. So Hans casts an 8th circle wide area spell, Sanctuary, sending out support circles that keep the building from collapsing. That is when Ivan's disciples, along with everyone else in the hall, finally realize that what they are witnessing is real magic. Porto can hardly believe it when he understands that Hans is actually a mage. Seeing that people are too stunned to move, Lakia shouts at the top of his lungs, ordering the mages to focus on evacuating everyone first. As the people rush out of the building, Hans moves toward the frightened enemy mage to confront him. Outside, the exceptionally rude noble from earlier starts declaring that he is leaving for his territory immediately, but his daughter Aya refuses, saying she still wants to remain at the academy and study there. The noble argues that the buildings were clearly poorly made, and the same thing could happen to the others at any time. But Aya disagrees, reminding him that they all just saw Hans use magic. She points out that the other academies are useless when it comes to teaching real magic, and her father knows that. Aya insists that Hans must be an incredible mage, and that the incident did not look like an accident at all. When her father asks what she means, she reminds him that Hans moved directly toward a strange man while they were fleeing, which means that man must have been involved somehow. Once the noble realizes it may have been an attack rather than an accident, he decides to stay and wait for the results of the investigation. At the same time, one of the nobles rushes over to Porto and demands to know why he is not treating her wounded son. Porto calmly tells her that the boy's injuries are minor and that common sense says the critically wounded must be treated first. The boy himself agrees, telling his mother that he is not badly hurt and that others need help more urgently. Because healing magic is so difficult to use, Porto insists it is only right to prioritize those in real danger. Then Tara appears and tells him that she and Byron have already treated everyone with minor injuries, but they have used up most of their mana. Porto says he will handle the rest, but one of the mothers overhears them talking about mana exhaustion and panics, asking what will happen if some of the children are dying. Porto apologizes and explains that mages are not all-powerful beings who can simply heal anything. At that very moment, Hans steps forward and demands to be taken to the ones in critical condition. As he is led there, Tara is startled to see that Hans's eyes have already returned to normal because she clearly saw them glowing yellow earlier. The butler then shows Hans the two most serious patients, both so badly injured that the others had not even dared attempt healing magic on them. Emergency carriages from the nearest clinic had already been requested. Hans ignores that and kneels beside the two children, placing his hands on them. When Porto sees this, he assumes Hans is acting recklessly, because magic is not some omnipotent force that can casually heal wounds like that. Even basic third circle healing is dangerous if mishandled, let alone attempting to heal severe injuries. Yet to everyone's shock, Hans pours an enormous amount of mana into both children and heals them instantly. The witnesses are left speechless, because the two are completely restored without so much as a scar left behind. That is when some of them begin to suspect Hans may actually stand on the same level as Ivan. Porto, however, is sharp enough to see the truth. Hans is clearly far beyond a fifth circle mage. Hans manages to take only a few steps before his legs give out from the sheer mana exhaustion. Thankfully, Lakia catches him before he can fall. Lakia asks if he is hurt, but Hans says he is fine, only drained from overusing his mana. Hans then asks whether the enemy mage was secured, and Lakia says yes, explaining that Assa is currently watching over him and that the man never even tried to resist. Lakia urges Hans to leave the rest to them since all of the injured have already been treated. Just then, Lakia senses that overwhelming presence again. He looks ahead and sees a man standing there, though he has no idea it is Crower. There is no killing intent coming from him, but Lakia can clearly tell that the man is dangerous. Crower studies Hans and Lakia for a few silent moments, then suddenly turns and walks away, leaving Lakia confused. Hans notices that Lakia looks unsettled, but Lakia tells him not to worry, saying it is nothing serious. He then suggests they head back to the castle as quickly as possible. Not long after, Regina and her husband arrive at Callista Castle. Hans steps out to greet them, and Regina immediately rushes over to check on him. The Emperor admits he is shocked by what happened, because when he was hurrying there, he was only worried about being late for the ceremony, never imagining something far worse would occur instead. He asks Hans if he is hurt, but Hans assures them that he will be fine, explaining that he only lost strength from mana depletion and just needs rest. The Emperor then asks whether the incident was truly an accident, but Hans tells him it is far more serious than that. He suggests they continue the discussion in the reception room. As they head inside, the Emperor orders the knights to make sure the castle is properly secured. Just as Ivan is about to follow them, his disciples suddenly grab him and drag him away to confront him in private. They are absolutely furious, shouting at him for never telling them that Hans was an archmage. Ivan explains that until now, the only people who knew were himself and the Emperor. He tells them that Hans was extremely particular about keeping his identity hidden, and the Emperor had agreed to help protect that secret. But now things are different, because everyone has seen it, and Ivan knows the two dukes are going to lose their minds over this revelation. The three disciples immediately begin panicking because they have been rude to Hans from the very beginning. Tara, in particular, starts wondering how she is supposed to recover her favor with him now. She even starts thinking about getting on her knees and begging Hans, but Porto tells her she is already going too far. Ivan then tells the three of them that Hans has promised to give them personal lessons later in exchange for serving as professors at the academy. That is the moment they truly lose their composure, blurting out absurd things like offering their own bodies as experimental subjects if that is what it takes. Ivan only makes it worse when he admits that he himself would have loved to study under Hans, considering that Hans is a sixth circle archmage. Porto still struggles to believe that Hans is truly a sixth circle mage, and Ivan tells them to think back carefully, because they were there and saw everything themselves. Porto replies that what unsettled him most was how strange Hans's magic felt, because they never heard him chant even once. Tara says the part that shocked her most was the healing magic. Ivan is completely thrown when he hears that Hans actually used healing magic as well. Tara explains that she still cannot understand how Hans structured his mana well enough to heal two critically injured people. Then Byron brings up something curious, the Academy's name. He points out that Saffred is the name of a legendary golden dragon, and half-jokingly throws out the theory that Hans might actually be a dragon. Ivan immediately crushes that idea and tells Byron to stop reading fantasy novels. Porto agrees with Ivan, reminding him that dragons went extinct over 100 years ago, so there is no way Hans could be one. Ivan then says that Hans may have named the academy after the dragon out of reverence, since all magic ultimately traces back to dragons. After that, he warns them to stop trying to pry into Hans's secrets, because mages do not appreciate having their private matters investigated. Once the discussion ends, Ivan steps away and leaves his students behind to keep talking about Hans. The three spend several minutes discussing him and what it might mean if someone like him could help revive the declining age of magic. Soon after, Ivan rejoins Hans, the Emperor, and Regina in the reception hall. Hans is actually glad to see him because he was just about to call for him. Hans tells him that the attacker has been captured and that the man turned out to be a mage. Ivan is horrified by this, because he does not want to believe that someone just committed an act of terror using magic. His first fear is that the Imperial mages were somehow involved, but Hans immediately dismisses that possibility, explaining that he can identify magical wavelengths within mana circles. He then reveals that the culprit is a fourth circle mage, and more importantly, a dark mage. Since there are no fourth circle mages among the Imperial mages, Ivan immediately doubts that the palace is involved. The Emperor is shaken by this and asks whether Hans is truly certain the culprit is a dark mage. Hans confirms it, and while the others are still reacting, Ivan suddenly speaks up and says the man's name, Kenan. The name means nothing to the others, and the way Ivan is trembling only makes the atmosphere worse. Outside the castle, First Knight Commander Petros and the Imperial Knights, Royal Guard Captain Chryson, are organizing the knights into defensive positions around the estate. Petros comments that he never expected to return to the castle after what happened the last time, back when he and his men were chasing Lakia. This is the same knight who once disrespected Regina, yet now he is serving under the Empress. Chryson immediately becomes interested when Lakia is mentioned, and he asks whether Petros personally confirmed Lakia's body. Petros replies that the corpse had already rotted badly by then, but Chryson presses further and asks whether there was any real way to identify it as Lakia. Petros starts wondering why Chryson is suddenly so interested in that old case, but Chryson brushes it aside and tells him to forget it. Unbeknownst to them, Lakia is watching from an office window, and it becomes clear that he has some kind of past connection with Chryson. Back in the reception hall, Ivan explains that Kenan was once his closest friend. Among the Imperial mages, Kenan was known as an extraordinary genius, and when he became the first of their generation to successfully wield fourth circle magic, the entire research institute was filled with admiration for him. But not everyone was pleased to see a commoner rise that high. Before long, Kenan was approached by two mages who showed him what they claimed was a fourth circle formula. They encouraged him to amplify it and demonstrate the spell for them. When Kenan studied the formula, he sensed that something was off, but the two men kept pressing him. Because he was desperate to earn their approval, he convinced himself it was his chance to win them over. So he cast it, and only then did he realize it was dark magic, which immediately took hold of him. Unlike ordinary magic, which uses the caster's own mana, dark magic offers the user's soul to demons in exchange for seemingly unlimited mana. Because of the atrocities committed through dark magic, the Empire classified it as a crime equal to treason and sealed it away as a forbidden taboo for centuries. That is why no one could recognize it just by looking at the formula. Kenan tried to explain to the judges that he had been tricked, but they did not care. To them, the fact that he had used dark magic was enough. He was expelled from the research institute and sentenced to death on the spot. Ivan explains that this was the last he ever heard of Kenan more than 10 years ago. He believed Kenan had already been executed, but now, with this dark mage appearing here, he is convinced it can only be him. Hans suggests that Ivan see him in person to confirm it for himself. Then he leads them down to the basement, and the Emperor is surprised to find that no guards are stationed there. Hans explains that guards are unnecessary, and at that moment the Emperor notices Ivan covering his face. When he asks what is wrong, Hans suddenly remembers and apologizes, because he forgot to mention that he already placed a barrier around the prison that allows only him to use magic inside it. Since Ivan's magic has been cut off, Hans politely says he will look away if Ivan is uncomfortable showing his real face. Deep down, Ivan is only marveling at how absurdly powerful Hans must be, because he just created a mana-blocking barrier that selectively allows certain people to use magic. Ivan is completely stunned, because he has never even heard of such a spell, and it only confirms that Hans is far beyond him when it comes to magic. Then they finally reach the cell, and the moment Kenan sees Ivan, he recoils from the bars. Ivan immediately confirms it, telling Hans that it really is Kenan. Hans is surprised, but then tells Ivan there is one problem: Kenan clearly is not in his right mind, and meaningful conversation with him has been impossible. Ivan asks how he ended up in such a state, but Hans says he has no idea. He explains that ever since Kenan was arrested, he has behaved strangely. Hans can confirm that he used dark magic, but in his current condition they cannot properly interrogate him, let alone formally charge him. The Emperor suggests turning the matter over to the Imperial Palace, because they need to know why a death row prisoner appeared inside Callista's territory in the first place. Ivan, however, is still struggling to process it all, because the Kenan he knew was someone who would not have hurt even a fly. Then, suddenly, Kenan seems to regain a fragment of awareness and recognizes Ivan standing beyond the cell. Meanwhile, Lakia and Assa climb to the top of a tower to keep watch over the estate. Lakia explains that they are there because of the suspicious man he saw at the academy. He says the man is strong, though he cannot yet tell whether he carries hostile intent or not. With the Emperor and Regina now at the castle, and Lakia already worn down, he believes they need to stay alert if they want to prevent another disaster. Assa is surprised that Lakia actually asked him to join the watch, especially since Lakia is usually irritated just by his presence. Lakia swallows his pride and admits that with what he felt from Crower, he cannot deal with him alone. That admission shocks Assa, but he still assures Lakia that they have little to fear, because cat people excel at detection. He is still talking when he suddenly spots Crower in the distance and immediately calls Lakia's attention to him. Lakia confirms that it is the same man, but before they can do anything, he vanishes right in front of them. At that point, even Assa is forced to admit that Lakia was right. They are not capable of handling Crower on their own. Once their scouting is done, Assa and Lakia go to Hans's chamber and report what they saw. Lakia says he saw the same man both at the academy and here at the house, which means Hans is clearly his target. He tells Hans that he and Assa tried to deal with the situation, but it became obvious that neither of them is a match for Crower. Then he warns Hans that he needs to be extremely careful. Hans is surprised to hear all of this, because earlier he had placed light surveillance magic around the castle, and that spell should have detected any outsider entering or moving through the grounds. Since he could not detect the intruder through normal means, Hans concludes that the person must be a mage. Meanwhile, Ivan, the Emperor and Regina have no choice but to remain at the castle because of everything that happened. Ivan had asked Hans if he could speak privately with Kenan, and Hans initially refused since Kenan committed a grave crime. But Ivan assures him that he has no intention of helping Kenan escape responsibility, and the Emperor adds that Hans can trust Ivan, because he is not someone who mixes personal feelings with matters of state. With everything happening at once, Hans begins to suspect that Crower may be working with Kenan and that another attack could happen at any moment. Because of that, he decides the castle's defenses must be raised to the highest level. A few days later, Hans's mother rushes down from the capital after hearing the news. She says the entire empire is already in an uproar, and while everyone is talking about the birth of a new archmage, she knows only that her son is a mage, leaving her curious about whether he is different from other mages. Realizing how much his family wants answers, Hans finally decides to come clean. He tells his mother and sister that he is not an ordinary mage, but the successor of a dragon. The revelation leaves both of them completely stunned. Owen immediately asks how such a thing is even possible, since dragons went extinct long ago. Hans then explains everything, and after hearing the full story, Owen is shocked to learn that there is a dragon lair hidden in the Compton Mountains. Regina adds that she now remembers Hans started acting strangely around that time. Owen also understands why he had to keep everything a secret, because the Compton Mountains border both Townsend and McCarthy territory, and if the lair had been discovered, it would have sparked a war. Instead, Hans's judgment prevented all of that. Owen then asks whether the recent incident is connected to the dragon's lair. Hans says he cannot be certain, but he is convinced that someone tried to eliminate him under the cover of destroying the building. Owen asks whether he is afraid, because no matter how powerful he becomes, he is still her son. She tells him not to shoulder everything by himself and reminds him that he can rely on his family whenever the burden grows too heavy. Regina supports that, adding that she is now the Empress, which makes her a dependable ally too. Hearing this, Owen says she feels relieved seeing both of her children standing at the top of their lives. Deep down, Hans is not afraid for himself. What truly scares him is the thought of his family getting hurt while he fails to protect them. Later that night, Crower returns to the castle and notices that a much stronger barrier has been placed around it this time. Even so, it is still not enough to stop him, and he breaks through the barrier to enter the compound. Hans is in his room when he senses a subtle distortion in the mana of the barrier, but what confuses him is that the barrier gives no proper alarm. Before he can fully react, Crower enters through the window. Fear grips Hans the moment he realizes that his sixth circle barrier has been breached. Even more strangely, the intruder does not carry the same kind of energy Kenan did. Then Hans gets a clear look at him, and the instant he sees the mismatched eyes it clicks, the man standing before him is Crower. Hans speaks his name aloud and Crower is surprised that Hans already knows who he is. At that same moment, Hans's mind is racing with questions, especially whether Crower has been behind everything from the beginning. But before he can sort through them, Crower throws out a question of his own, asking why dragon energy is pouring out of Hans's body. because while his body is clearly human, his magic feels like that of a dragon. With a cold and dangerous voice, Crower asks what Hans really is. That question nearly makes Hans lose himself in fear. Remembering what Lakia and Assa said about Crower, Hans immediately understands that the man in front of him is extremely dangerous. With panic in his voice, Hans tells him not to come any closer. Then it hits him that everyone in his family is still inside the castle, and if he falls here, they will all be in danger too. Driven by that fear, Hans launches an air burst spell. But to his shock, Crower does not even try to dodge. The spell lands, yet it is completely erased on impact, leaving Crower totally unharmed. Cold sweat runs down Hans's face because until now he believed he had reached a level of magic where few could rival him. What just happened proves he was wrong. Surprisingly, Crower himself looks impressed, commenting on how Hans cast without a chant. Now more curious than hostile, he presses Hans again and asks what he is. Realizing that Crower's interest comes from curiosity rather than immediate malice, Hans admits that it is dragon magic, just as Crower suspected. He explains that he is a human who inherited a dragon's power and can use dragon word magic. Crower wants to know more, but Hans refuses, pointing out that he has no reason to tell him anything further. Then Crower asks whether the dragon who passed that power on was the golden dragon Saffrid. Hans is stunned, asking whether Crower could tell that just from looking at him. He then asks whether Crower had some connection to Saffrid, but Crower says no, explaining that he only guessed because of the academy's name. He then reveals that he too was born after the dragons had already gone extinct. And then in a shocking twist, Crower reveals that he is a guardian. More specifically, he is the guardian of the black dragon Lintos. Hans is stunned because he never expected a human to be a guardian. Crower then formally introduces himself as Chivon Crower and explains that his grandfather was the first in their family to inherit the dragon's mark, which was later passed down to him. Hans is shocked again because dragons have been gone for more than 500 years. Crower explains that those who inherit the mark gain greatly extended lifespans, though the bloodline has weakened over generations. His grandfather lived to 500 years, but his father only made it to 400. He says his father tried to live among humans and even founded a noble house, but in the end, he still never truly fit into human society. Hans then asks how his identity remained hidden for so long, especially when leadership changes only once every 100 years. He wonders whether the imperial family and the two ducal houses simply chose to leave him alone. Crower replies that the ducal houses probably know to some extent, which is exactly why they have helped keep his identity hidden, because the balance of power would shift if people realized what kind of force the Marquis truly commands. At that point, Hans finally understands that Crower sought him out not because of hostility, but because he was lonely. But before the conversation can continue, Assa and Lakia burst into the room. They immediately put themselves between Hans and Crower, convinced he came to harm him. Hans quickly tells them to calm down, saying he does not believe Crower came with hostile intent. Lakia argues back, reminding him that Crower has been appearing around them repeatedly. Then, without warning, Crower calls Lakia by his real name, leaving everyone in the room stunned. They immediately demand to know how he could possibly know Lakia's true identity. Crower explains that the eye granted to him by the dragon is the eye of truth, which allows him to see through falsehood no matter how carefully it is hidden. Only then does Hans fully explain to Assa and Lakia who Crower is. And in that moment, Lakia realizes that Crower is the very man Hans has been trying to find all this time. Hans suggests they address Crower formally, but Crower immediately rejects that and tells them to simply call him by name. Hans is startled by this, but Crower says that plain speech makes him far more comfortable. Hans tries to remind him that there is still a hierarchy to consider, but Crower dismisses that idea, saying titles are nothing more than rules made by humans. Since guardians exist to serve dragons, Crower then makes an even more shocking declaration. He intends to serve Hans as well. The room falls into stunned silence, but Hans refuses on the spot. He says he already has more than enough people to worry about and protect, and he is not about to add yet another person to that burden.